The animation team behind Invincible spent years hiding secrets inside a show most people watch through their fingers, so let's slow it all the way down and find every single one of them. Invincible is an animated superhero series that premiered on Amazon Prime Video in March of 2021. It is based on the comic book series created by Robert Kirkman, the same mind behind The Walking Dead. The show follows 17-year-old Mark Grayson, a teenager who is just trying to survive high school while also figuring out that he is slowly developing superpowers. His father, Nolan Grayson, goes by the name Omni-Man, and he is essentially the most powerful superhero on Earth. Think of the strongest, most respected hero you can imagine, and that is Nolan. He has been protecting the planet for years, and Mark just wants to be like him. What makes Invincible so special right from the start is the way it handles expectations. For the first 20 to 25 minutes of the very first episode, it genuinely looks and feels like a typical superhero origin story. The colors are bright, the tone is upbeat, Mark is a lovable, awkward teenager, and everything seems cheerful and optimistic. The creative team behind the show did this intentionally. They wanted the audience to feel completely safe and comfortable before pulling the rug out from under them. That tonal bait and switch is one of the most talked about decisions in the entire first episode, and it works spectacularly. The show is produced by Skybound Entertainment, which is Robert Kirkman's own production company, giving him a level of creative control that a lot of comic creators never get when their work is adapted. Kirkman actually served as an executive producer on the series, meaning he was deeply involved in the decisions being made about how the story would translate from page to screen. That involvement shows in how faithfully the series respects the source material, while also finding smart ways to expand and breathe new life into it. One of the first things you notice about Invincible is its voice cast, and it is genuinely one of the most impressive assembled for any animated project in recent memory. Steven Yeun voices Mark Grayson, bringing this warm, earnest quality to the character that makes you root for him immediately. Steven Yeun is best known for his live-action work, including his role in The Walking Dead and his Oscar-nominated performance in the film Minari. His involvement in Invincible speaks to how seriously the production took the project. This was not a casual animated gig. This was a full commitment to bringing depth and authenticity to the character. Yotka. Simmons voices Omni-Man, and honestly, the casting is so perfect it almost feels like it was inevitable. Simmons has this natural commanding authority in his voice. When Nolan speaks, you listen. There is a weight to every word, a sense that this is a man who has seen and done things that most people cannot comprehend. And as the season progresses and we learn more about who Nolan truly is, that vocal authority takes on a much more unsettling quality. The way Simmons modulates between warm father and terrifying force of nature is genuinely impressive work. Sandra Oh voices Debbie Grayson, Mark's mother, and her performance is quietly one of the most emotionally affecting things about the entire season. Debbie starts out as a fairly typical supportive mother figure, but as the season unfolds and the truth about Nolan begins to surface, Sandra Oh gets to do some extraordinary emotional heavy lifting. The audience feels every crack in Debbie's world through her voice alone, and that is a testament to both the writing and Oh's craft. The show also features J. Robert Oppenheimer. No wait, that is the famous physicist. The show features Zazie Beetz as Amber, Mark's girlfriend, Gillian Jacobs as Adam Eve, Andrew Rannells as William, and an almost absurd number of celebrity cameos and supporting roles that pop up throughout the season. Mark Hamill is in the show. Walton Goggins is in the show. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who are actually two of the showrunners, both provide voices. The sheer density of talent in this cast is something that fans talk about frequently. Now let us talk about the animation itself, because this is something that deserves real appreciation. The show is produced by Skybound Animation in partnership with Amazon Studios, and the animation style is deliberately reminiscent of classic American superhero cartoons from the late 90s and early 2000s. Think of that era of animation where everything had clean lines, expressive faces, and dynamic action sequences. The show channels that nostalgic energy while simultaneously pushing into territory that those older cartoons would never dare to go. The color palette of the show is worth noticing. In quieter, more domestic scenes, the colors are warm and a little soft. There is a comfort to those moments, a visual language that says everything is fine, everything is normal. But when action sequences begin, and especially when violence escalates, the colors become more saturated, more intense. The show uses color as an emotional guide, steering your feelings before the dialogue or action even registers consciously. One of the more interesting technical decisions made by the animation team involves the way blood and injury are depicted. This is a show that does not shy away from the consequences of superhero combat. When people get hurt in Invincible, it looks like it hurts. This was a deliberate creative choice rooted in a specific philosophy. The creators wanted the violence to feel meaningful rather than consequence-free. In most superhero content, characters trade blows without any visible lasting damage, which can make the stakes feel artificial. Invincible refuses to let that happen. The show's first season covers roughly the first 13 issues of the original comic series, though with some adjustments and additions. The pacing is notably different from the comics, with the television adaptation taking time to develop relationships and emotional dynamics that the comics sometimes moved past quickly. This was a smart adaptation choice because television audiences need to feel emotionally connected to characters before those characters are put through difficult situations. By the time the season reaches its pivotal moments, you genuinely care about everyone involved. Let us talk about Adam Eve for a moment, because she is one of the most fascinating characters in the season. Eve Wilkins has the ability to rearrange matter at a molecular level, which makes her arguably one of the most powerful characters in the entire show. She can transform one substance into another, create things from nothing, and theoretically reshape reality itself if she wanted to. But she was raised and trained by a government organization that encouraged her to use her powers in limited, controlled ways. The tension between Eve's extraordinary potential and the constraints placed on her by others is one of the recurring themes of her character arc. What is interesting about Eve is that her power, while incredible, is shown to have real emotional and physical costs. Using her abilities extensively drains her. There is a fatigue that comes with pushing her powers to their limits, and the show portrays this not as a simple weakness but as a reminder that even immense power comes with a price. This humanizes her in ways that make her far more compelling than a character who simply has unlimited capability. The Guardians of the Globe are another element worth exploring. These are Earth's premier superhero team in the Invincible universe, essentially the Justice League equivalent of this world. They are powerful, respected, and seemingly unstoppable. The show introduces them with genuine affection, letting you spend just enough time with them to appreciate their personalities and dynamics. There is Dark Wing, who has an obvious Batman energy. There is Green Ghost, War Woman, Aquarius, Red Rush, and the Immortal leading the team. Each one is distinct enough to feel like a real character rather than just set dressing. The decision to invest even a small amount of time developing the Guardians before the end of the first episode is a masterful storytelling choice. Because what happens to the Guardians in the final act of that first episode lands so much harder when you have already started to feel something for them. The show knew exactly what it was doing, and it executed that setup with precision. Cecil Stedman is a character who deserves a lot of attention. He is voiced by Walton Goggins, and he runs a secret government organization called the Global Defense Agency. Cecil is genuinely one of the most morally complicated characters in the entire season. He is not a villain in the traditional sense, but he is absolutely not a hero either. He operates in a world of hard choices and calculated sacrifices, and he makes those choices with a cool, almost clinical detachment that is deeply unsettling when you think about what it actually means in practice. The interesting thing about Cecil is that nearly everything he does is technically in service of protecting humanity. His motivations are understandable, even sympathetic in the abstract. But the methods he employs and the lengths he is willing to go to are the kinds of things that make you deeply uncomfortable. Walton Goggins brings exactly the right energy to this role, that particular flavor of charming menace that he has deployed to great effect throughout his career. There is a character named the Mauler twins who appear in the season, and they are a fascinating creation. They are clones who have lost track of which of them is the original. Each twin believes himself to be the genuine article and the other to be the copy, but neither can actually prove it, and they have essentially given up trying to resolve the question. What is wonderful about this detail is that it says so much about identity and selfhood in just a few words. The Mauler twins are comic book villains, but that one character detail elevates them into something that touches on genuinely philosophical territory. The show handles the theme of legacy with remarkable sophistication throughout the season. Mark is not just trying to become a superhero. He is trying to become his father. He wants to earn the Omni-Man name, to live up to the standard that his father has set. Almost everything Mark does in the early episodes is filtered through this desire for paternal approval. He trains harder because he wants his dad to be proud. He tries to understand his powers because he wants to share something meaningful with Nolan. That emotional drive is the engine of the entire season. What makes this so effective dramatically is what happens when the object of that admiration is revealed to be something else entirely. When the truth about Nolan begins to emerge, it does not just change how you see Nolan. It recontextualizes every warm father-son moment that came before it. You replay those scenes in your mind and you read them differently. That retroactive reframing is one of the most powerful storytelling techniques available, and Invincible deploys it with devastating effectiveness. The show includes a sequence in episode 4 that is particularly worth mentioning. Without getting too deeply into the specifics, there is a mission involving a group of superpowered teenagers that goes genuinely and horribly wrong. The sequence is difficult to watch and intentionally so. But what is remarkable about it is how the show handles the aftermath. The emotional and psychological consequences of what happens are not swept under the rug. Characters grieve. Characters struggle. The show insists on sitting with the weight of what occurred rather than moving past it quickly, and that commitment to emotional honesty is one of the things that separates Invincible from most superhero content. Teen Team is the junior superhero group that Mark occasionally interacts with, and their dynamic is interesting because it mirrors a lot of typical teenage social structures. There is hierarchy, there is competition, there is the particular awkwardness of young people trying to prove themselves. Atom Eve is part of this group, as is Rexplode, whose relationship with Eve is one of the season's more grounded and relatable emotional threads. Rex is charming in a frustrating way, the kind of person who is easy to like and easy to be annoyed by simultaneously, and the show uses that quality to great effect. The music in Invincible is something that does not get discussed enough. The score was composed by John Paisano, and it does extraordinary work throughout the season. Paisano understands that music in a show like this needs to serve multiple emotional registers. There are moments when the score needs to swell with genuine heroic energy, and Paisano delivers that. But there are also moments when the music needs to be quietly ominous, threading a sense of unease beneath a scene that looks perfectly ordinary, and Paisano handles those moments with particular skill. The tonal complexity of the score mirrors the tonal complexity of the show itself. Let us take a moment to appreciate the show's approach to world building, because it is genuinely impressive. The Invincible universe is enormous. There are multiple alien civilizations, secret government programs, interdimensional threats, and dozens of established superheroes all coexisting in the same world. And yet the first season never feels overwhelming. The world building is introduced gradually and always in service of the story being told in the moment. You never feel like the show is stopping to explain its mythology. Instead, the mythology emerges naturally through character interactions and plot events. The Viltrumite civilization is the most important piece of world building in the season, and the show is remarkably patient about revealing its full significance. Viltrumites are Nolan's people, a warrior race of near-indestructible beings who have built an empire spanning thousands of worlds. The show drops hints about what this means throughout the season before finally laying out the full picture in the closing episodes. By that point, the implications are staggering, and the audience is fully equipped to understand exactly why what they are learning is so devastating. The relationship between Mark and his best friend William is a lovely thread running through the season. William is not a superhero. He does not know about Mark's powers for most of the season. He is just a regular kid who is trying to figure out his own identity, including his sexuality, which the show addresses with a refreshing matter-of-factness. William's storyline is small compared to the superhero drama happening around it, but it is vital because it keeps Mark grounded in a recognizably human world. Without William, Mark might float away entirely into the superhero narrative and lose some of what makes him relatable. There is a character named Damien Darkblood, a demon detective, who shows up in a handful of episodes investigating the mystery of what happened to the Guardians of the Globe. Darkblood is a fascinating creation, a figure from hell who has chosen to spend his existence solving crimes rather than committing them. He is given almost no backstory, and yet he manages to feel fully realized through a combination of sharp design, economical writing, and excellent voice performance. He is the kind of character who could carry his own series, and his departure from a show's story is handled in a way that is simultaneously satisfying and quietly melancholy. The show's finale is one of the most emotionally intense pieces of superhero storytelling ever put to screen. The confrontation between Mark and Nolan that serves as the season's climax is a long sequence, almost uncomfortably extended, and that length is part of what makes it so effective. This is not a quick, clean resolution. It is a prolonged, brutal reckoning that refuses to give either character or the audience an easy out. The emotional content of that sequence, the love and betrayal and grief and desperation tangled together, is handled with a sophistication that rivals the best dramatic television regardless of genre. J.K. Simmons' vocal performance in that finale sequence is something that people who worked on the show have pointed to as one of the highlights of the entire production. The range he covers, from cold authority to something that sounds disturbingly close to pleading, across the course of that conversation is remarkable. And Stephen Yeun matches him completely, delivering a performance that captures exactly what it feels like to have the person you most admire in the world reveal themselves to be something you cannot reconcile with the image you held of them. The show was renewed for a second and third season before the first season had even finished airing, which speaks to the confidence Amazon had in the property. That confidence was clearly justified given how the show was received by both critics and audiences. The response to Invincible Season 1 was remarkably enthusiastic, with particular praise going to the voice performances, the animation quality, the writing, and the willingness to take the genre seriously rather than treating superhero stories as inherently lightweight material. One of the more interesting behind-the-scenes facts about the production involves the sheer number of episodes that were developed simultaneously. Because Amazon ordered multiple seasons before production was complete, the creative team was able to plan long-term story arcs from very early in the process. This kind of structural freedom is rare in television, and it shows in the writing. The first season plants seeds that will pay off much later, and the team was able to do this knowing that they would actually have the chance to deliver on those promises. The design of Omni-Man's costume is worth a brief appreciation. It is deliberately simple, almost aggressively so compared to the intricate designs of other characters. The black cape, the dark suit, the large mustache that became an internet sensation unto itself. The visual simplicity of Omni-Man's design communicates something important about the character. He does not need elaborate armor or flashy technology. He is the weapon. Everything about him is contained in his physical presence, and the stripped-down costume reflects that. Cecil's scarring, the visible damage to his face, is a visual element that carries significant narrative weight. It represents a story from the past, a consequence of decisions made long before the events of the first season. The show does not rush to explain it. The scars are simply there, a constant physical reminder that this world has a history full of difficult choices and real consequences. That kind of visual storytelling, letting a design element communicate character backstory without explicit exposition, is one of the hallmarks of sophisticated animation. The first season of Invincible also does something interesting with the concept of heroism itself. The Global Defense Agency, Cecil's organization, represents a certain pragmatic approach to protecting humanity. They make deals that are morally uncomfortable. They deploy assets in ways that could be described as using people rather than working with them. Their effectiveness is real, but so is their willingness to compromise on ethical questions when the stakes are high enough. This creates an ongoing tension about what it actually means to protect the world and whether good intentions justify troubling methods. Mark wrestles with this tension throughout the season, and his discomfort with some of what Cecil represents is an important part of his character development. Mark is not naive exactly, but he holds on to an idea of heroism that is fundamentally about doing good rather than just achieving good outcomes. The difference between those two things, and the question of whether that distinction can survive contact with a world full of genuinely terrifying threats, is one of the season's most intellectually interesting questions. There is a lovely detail about the way the show depicts Mark's school life. His high school feels genuinely lived in rather than generic. The social dynamics, the particular rhythms of teenage existence, the way time moves differently at that age, all of it feels observed and authentic. The creative team clearly believed that the superhero elements of the show would only matter as much as the human elements beneath them, and the effort put into the high school setting reflects that belief. Amber as a character gets some criticism from certain viewers who feel she is not developed enough in the first season, and that is a fair observation in some respects. But it is also worth noting that Amber demonstrates a grounded practicality and emotional intelligence that distinguishes her from the typical love interest in this kind of story. She is not waiting to be defined by her relationship with Mark. She has her own values, her own sense of purpose, her own lines she will not cross. Those qualities are established quietly, but they are there if you are paying attention. The show uses a specific narrative technique that might be called delayed revelation, where information is withheld not to manipulate the audience but to replicate the experience of a character who does not yet have access to that information. We learn things when Mark learns them, and we are disoriented when Mark is disoriented. This creates a powerful sense of alignment between the audience and the protagonist that makes every discovery hit with the emotional force of a personal revelation rather than a plot update. There is something worth noting about the show's handling of grief, particularly in the later episodes. When characters experience loss, the show gives that loss room to breathe. There are quiet scenes that exist specifically to let the weight of what has happened settle on both the characters and the audience. This is a discipline that a lot of action-focused storytelling lacks. Invincible understands that audiences need to feel the cost of events before moving on, and it honors that need consistently. The season concludes with Mark fundamentally changed from the person he was in the first episode, but not in a way that feels arbitrary or forced. Every development in his character arc traces back to specific experiences and relationships and choices. His transformation feels earned rather than imposed, which is one of the most important qualities a season of television can have. When you finish watching and you think back to where Mark began, the distance he has traveled is genuinely striking. One final thing worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep is just the broader significance of what Invincible Season 1 accomplished in the landscape of superhero media. It demonstrated that the genre could support genuinely complex, emotionally sophisticated storytelling without sacrificing entertainment value or accessibility. It took the things that make superhero stories compelling and used them as a foundation for something that asked harder questions and demanded more from its audience. And it did all of this while still being completely, thoroughly watchable, the kind of show that pulls you through episode after episode without you quite realizing how much time has passed. The legacy of this first season is a show that earned its place among the most celebrated animated series of its era, not just among superhero content but among ambitious storytelling more broadly. It reminded audiences and creators alike that animation is not a limitation but a possibility space, a medium capable of things that live action cannot always achieve, and that the stories told there can be every bit as affecting and meaningful as anything else on your screen. So as you settle in tonight, let these details and stories drift through your mind. The care taken with every voice performance, the deliberate visual choices, the patience of the storytelling, the richness of the world that Kirkman and the creative team built together. The way a teenage boy trying to be like his father became one of the most resonant origin stories in superhero fiction. All of that is waiting for you to revisit it, to notice new things, to appreciate how much craft went into every single frame of this extraordinary first season. Rest well. The world of Invincible will be there when you wake up. What if I told you that one of the most quietly brilliant things about Invincible Season 2 has absolutely nothing to do with the punching, the blood, or the dimension-hopping chaos that dominates every conversation about the show? What if the most fascinating layer of that season is happening in the background, in the quieter moments, in the scenes that most people scroll past when they're recapping the highlights. Stick around because we are about to go deep into some genuinely mind-blowing facts about Invincible Season 2 that you probably never noticed, and I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at that season completely differently. These are the kind of facts that are perfect to have drifting through your mind as you drift off to sleep. So get comfortable, because this is going to be a good one. Let us start at the very beginning of what makes Season 2 so special on a structural level. The showrunners made a deliberate creative decision to slow things down compared to Season 1, and this was not an accident. After a first season that moved at absolute breakneck speed and culminated in one of the most shocking animated moments in recent memory, the creative team behind the show chose to let Season 2 breathe. They wanted the audience to sit with the trauma, to feel the weight of what had happened rather than immediately rushing into the next massive conflict. That decision was controversial for some viewers who wanted the pace to stay relentless, but the more you think about it, the more brilliant it becomes. Great storytelling is not just about what happens. It is about how what has already happened continues to echo through everything that comes after. And speaking of echoes, one of the most interesting things about Season 2 is how deeply it is concerned with the psychological aftermath of violence. Mark Grayson is not just dealing with the fact that his father was the villain all along. He is dealing with the specific horror of having been nearly beaten to death by someone who loved him. That is a very particular kind of trauma, and the writers took real care to show how it changes the way Mark moves through the world. You can see it in the way he hesitates in certain fights, in the way his confidence has this new fragile quality underneath the surface bravado. Season 1 Mark was cocky in a way that felt earned and fun. Season 2 Mark is cocky in a way that sometimes feels like a performance he is putting on for himself as much as anyone else. Now here is something that a lot of casual viewers completely miss. The color palette of Season 2 shifts in subtle but meaningful ways depending on whose emotional state we are tracking in any given scene. The animation team put enormous thought into how light and color could be used to communicate internal experience without any dialogue at all. When Mark is at his most vulnerable, the scenes around him tend to pull toward cooler, more muted tones. When he is at his most powerful or confident, the saturation cranks up and the warm tones come flooding back in. This is not always consistent, and sometimes it shifts mid-scene, which is actually the point. His emotional state is unstable, and the visual language of the show reflects that instability in real time. The relationship between Mark and his mother Debbie is one of the most underappreciated emotional threads in the entire season. Think about what Debbie is going through. She spent years in a loving marriage with a man who turned out to be living a double life of almost incomprehensible brutality. Her whole identity as a wife and as a family unit has been obliterated. And yet she still has to be a mother to a teenager who is also processing this betrayal while simultaneously saving the world on a semi-regular basis. The scenes between Sandra Oh, who voices Debbie, and Stephen Yeun, who voices Mark, have this incredible weight to them. There is so much that both characters want to say and cannot quite find the words for, and that gap between what they want to express and what they actually manage to articulate is where some of the most honest emotional writing in the whole series lives. Here is a fascinating behind-the-scenes fact about the voice cast that most people do not know. The actors in Invincible often record their lines separately, which is completely standard for animation production. But what makes Invincible a little different is that the showrunners and writers have spoken about how certain emotionally pivotal scenes were orchestrated to give the actors as much context as possible before recording, even when they were not in the booth together. The goal was to make the performances feel reactive and lived in rather than isolated. And when you go back and listen to Season 2 with that knowledge in your head, you start to hear things differently. The pauses are more loaded. The breaths before certain lines carry more meaning. It is the kind of craft that does not call attention to itself but that you feel without necessarily being able to name it. Let us talk about Angstrom Levi, because he is one of the most thematically rich villains in the whole show, and Season 2 really leans into what makes him work. What is interesting about Angstrom is that he starts the season as someone you could almost sympathize with. He is not evil in a mustache-twirling way. He has a genuine grievance and a genuine goal. He wants to help people across dimensions, to aggregate knowledge and use it for good. The tragedy of his arc is that the transformation he undergoes, both physically and psychologically, turns all of that altruistic intention into something unrecognizable. He becomes a monster not because he wanted to be one, but because of a sequence of events that he only partly caused and that partly happened to him. That moral ambiguity is so much more interesting than a straightforward bad guy, and it makes the conflict between him and Mark feel genuinely tragic rather than just exciting. One of the things the show does brilliantly in Season 2 is use the concept of parallel universes not just as a plot device but as a genuine philosophical tool. When Angstrom can access countless alternate realities, you start thinking about what that means for identity and choice. Every version of a person that exists across infinite dimensions represents a different set of decisions, a different set of circumstances, a different life. And yet something remains constant at the core. That question of what remains constant, of what is essential about a person no matter what variables change around them, is something the season keeps returning to in different ways. It is not always explicit, but it is always there, running underneath the surface of the action. Now I want to spend some time on something that gets almost no attention in the discourse around this season, and that is the sound design. Invincible has always had extraordinary sound design, but Season 2 takes it to a new level. The way impacts are layered, the way the silence before a major moment of violence is held just a beat too long so that when the hit lands it feels almost physically shocking. These are decisions that take enormous skill and intentionality. The sound team works in close collaboration with the animation team to make sure that what you see and what you hear are creating a unified experience. Some of the most brutal moments in Season 2 hit as hard as they do not just because of how they look, but because of how they sound. The audio is doing as much emotional work as the visuals in many key scenes. Here is something genuinely surprising about the production timeline for Season 2. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 was significantly longer than most fans expected. And a big part of that was because the team wanted to use the additional time to refine the animation quality beyond what they had been able to achieve in the first season. If you sit down and do a careful comparison between certain scenes from Season 1 and equivalent scenes from Season 2, the difference in fluidity and detail is noticeable. The fight choreography in particular got a significant upgrade. The team spent a lot of time studying real martial arts and physics to make the way these superhuman characters move feel more grounded and believable, even when the things they are doing are completely impossible by the laws of physics as we understand them. The Cecil Stedman storyline in Season 2 is one that rewards really careful attention. Cecil is such a fascinating character because he operates in this completely immoral utilitarian framework where the only thing that matters is outcomes. He is not cruel for the sake of it. He genuinely believes that everything he does is in service of protecting humanity. But the show refuses to simply validate that worldview, and it also refuses to simply condemn it. There is no easy answer to the question Cecil raises, and that discomfort is intentional. When you have a character who does objectively terrible things for arguably defensible reasons, you as the audience are forced to sit with the complexity of it. Season 2 pushes that discomfort further by showing how Cecil's approach creates real consequences for real people, even as it sometimes genuinely works. Something that does not get nearly enough credit is how Season 2 handles the supporting cast. Characters like William, Eve, and Amber all get moments this season that give them genuine depth and agency beyond their relationships with Mark. William in particular goes through something in Season 2 that fundamentally changes how you see him, and the writing around his arc is remarkably thoughtful. The show understands that the world Mark inhabits is full of people who are dealing with extraordinary things in very ordinary ways, and that contrast is part of what gives the emotional moments their power. Not everyone has superpowers. Not everyone can punch their way through their problems. Most of the characters on the show have to find other ways through, and watching them do that is often more compelling than watching Mark punch something very hard. Let us get into some of the more technical and nerdy aspects of the production, because there is genuinely fascinating stuff here. The animation studio behind Invincible uses a combination of digital tools and techniques that allow them to create a visual style that is deliberately reminiscent of the original comic book art. Robert Kirkman's source material has a very specific visual identity, and translating that to animation without losing what made it distinctive was a major creative challenge. The line work in the animated series is not trying to be photorealistic. It has a certain flatness and directness that is very much in conversation with the comics, and yet it also does things that only animation can do. The way characters move, the way the camera operates in action sequences, these are things that simply cannot exist on a comic book page, and the team embraces that rather than fighting against it. The multiverse storyline in Season 2 also allowed the writers to do something really clever from a narrative perspective, which is to show us versions of the story that could have gone differently. When you see alternate versions of characters making different choices or facing different circumstances, it creates this implicit argument that the choices our main characters have made are not inevitable. Things could have gone another way. Mark could have become something else. Nolan could have chosen differently. The fact that they ended up where they did is the result of specific decisions made under specific pressures, and the multiverse framing makes that visible in a way that a more linear narrative structure would not allow. Now here is something I find endlessly interesting about Season 2, which is how it handles the theme of legacy. Mark is fundamentally a character who is trying to figure out what it means to be a hero in the shadow of a father who is definitively not one. Every choice he makes is in some sense a response to Nolan. Every time he could take a shortcut and chooses not to, it is a statement about who he wants to be versus who he was raised by. That is not just compelling drama. It is a really honest engagement with how we all carry our parents with us, how we are shaped by them even when we are actively trying to be different from them, and how that process of differentiation is never as clean or complete as we would like it to be. The Viltrumite Empire as a whole gets more development in Season 2, and what makes them interesting is that they are not just brutes. They have a complex civilization with its own internal logic, its own history, its own sense of honor and hierarchy. Understanding that does not make them less threatening. If anything, it makes them more so, because it means that the conflict is not just a matter of good versus evil. It is a collision of civilizations with genuinely incompatible values, and neither side fully understands the other. That kind of conflict is much harder to resolve than one that is simply about defeating a bad guy, and Season 2 is very aware of that complexity. Let us talk about something that is maybe a little more abstract but that I think is central to why Season 2 resonates the way it does. The season is, at its core, about what it costs to be good. Not just what it costs in terms of physical danger, though there is plenty of that. It is about the emotional cost, the relational cost, the cost to your sense of self. Being a hero in the Invincible universe is not a glamorous or comfortable thing. It is exhausting and thankless, and it puts you in impossible situations where every option has terrible consequences. The show does not romanticize that. It sits with the difficulty of it, and that honesty is part of what makes it feel more real than most superhero content. Here is a detail that I genuinely love, and it is the kind of thing you only catch if you are paying very close attention. Throughout Season 2, there are small visual callbacks to moments from Season 1 that work almost like emotional bookmarks. A character will be in a pose or a lighting setup that echoes an earlier scene, and the resonance between the two moments adds a layer of meaning to the current one that would not be there without that reference. The animators and directors are very deliberate about these moments. They are not accidents or coincidences. They are part of a carefully constructed visual language that rewards repeat viewing and careful attention. The trauma processing that happens in Season 2 extends not just to Mark and Debbie, but to essentially every character who is in some way connected to what happened at the end of Season 1. The show understands that trauma is not a singular event but a process, and that different people move through that process at very different rates and in very different ways. Some characters cope by throwing themselves into action. Some withdraw. Some become harder and more closed off. Some reach out desperately for connection. The variety of responses feels true to life in a way that is relatively rare in genre storytelling, where the tendency is usually to have characters process trauma quickly and then get back to the main plot. Now I want to take a moment to appreciate the music of Season 2, because it is doing extraordinary work and deserves more attention than it typically gets. The score for Invincible has always been interesting, but Season 2 introduces some new sonic textures that perfectly complement the more psychologically complex tone of the season. There are moments where the music does something almost unsettling, where it sits in a register that is neither triumphant nor tragic but something in between, something that leaves you feeling uncertain in exactly the way the narrative wants you to feel uncertain. That kind of precision in musical storytelling is not easy to achieve, and the composers deserve enormous credit for it. Something that is worth noting about the production of the show is the way it manages its most intense scenes. Because Invincible deals with extremely graphic violence, the creative team has had to think carefully about when to deploy that graphicness and when to pull back. The violence in the show is never gratuitous in the sense of being there purely for shock value. It always has emotional and narrative purpose. But the team also understands that you cannot maintain shock as a consistent baseline. If everything is equally intense all the time, nothing feels intense. So they are very strategic about building and releasing tension, about letting episodes breathe so that when the violence comes it still has the power to land with full force. Let us circle back to Nolan for a moment, because even though he is largely absent from Season 2 in a physical sense, his presence is felt constantly. The writers do something really smart with this, which is to make Nolan's absence itself a kind of presence. Every time Mark is struggling, every time the emotional weight of what has happened becomes too much, Nolan is right there not as a character in the scene, but as a gravitational force shaping everything around him. The decision to structure the season this way, to let the most powerful character in the show's recent history be felt rather than seen for much of the runtime, is a brave one, and it works beautifully. Here is something interesting about how the show approaches morality that I think distinguishes it from most superhero content. Invincible does not have a simple moral framework. It does not tell you who the good guys and bad guys are and then ask you to root for the good guys. Instead, it presents a world in which almost every significant character has done something that is genuinely questionable and then asks you to hold that complexity without resolving it. That is uncomfortable for an audience that is used to moral clarity from their superhero stories, but it is also much more honest about how actual human beings and their choices actually work. The animation of facial expressions in Season 2 is something that I think gets underappreciated. So much of what makes the show work emotionally is communicated through very subtle shifts in expression, the micromovements of features that convey internal states that the dialogue does not fully articulate. The animators clearly studied human emotional expression in enormous detail, and the result is characters whose faces feel genuinely alive and psychologically inhabited rather than just being vessels for moving the plot forward. When Mark looks scared, it is a very specific kind of scared that tells you something about the nature of his fear, not just that he is afraid. The show's handling of its romantic relationships in Season 2 is also worth examining. The Mark and Amber dynamic reaches a really honest and somewhat painful moment this season, and the show handles the end of their relationship without villainizing either character. Both of them are doing the best they can with genuinely difficult circumstances. Both of them make choices that are understandable even when those choices hurt the other person. The willingness to let a relationship end without declaring anyone the bad guy is mature storytelling, and it models something important about how relationships actually work in the real world. Now here is a genuinely fascinating production fact. The team behind Invincible has access to Robert Kirkman, the creator of the original comic, in a way that many adaptation teams do not have access to the source material's creator. Kirkman has been involved in the production of the animated series in a very hands-on way, and this has allowed the show to develop in directions that diverge from the comics when dramatically appropriate, with the blessing and guidance of the person who created these characters. That level of creative continuity between source material and adaptation is rare, and it shows in the confidence with which the show makes choices that the comics did not make. The Season 2 finale deserves its own discussion because it does something structurally interesting that most finales do not attempt. Rather than resolving the season's central conflicts in a way that provides clean closure, it instead positions the viewer at the threshold of something even larger and more complex that is coming. This is not the same as leaving things unresolved for the sake of it. The emotional arcs of the season do reach meaningful stopping points, but the larger narrative continues to unfold, and the finale is very deliberate about making you feel the vastness of what is still ahead rather than the satisfaction of what has been completed. That is a bold choice that trusts the audience to tolerate ambiguity, and audiences who have been paying attention fully deserve that trust. Something I want to highlight because it genuinely moved me when I noticed it is the way Season 2 treats hope. Despite everything, despite the violence and the betrayal and the ongoing existential threats, the show has this persistent undercurrent of hope. Not naive hope, not the kind of hope that ignores how terrible things can be, but a harder one kind that persists precisely because the characters have seen how bad things can get and are still choosing to fight for something better. That is the kind of hope that actually means something, and it is what keeps Invincible from becoming nihilistic despite dealing with genuinely nihilistic subject matter in several of its storylines. The dimensional travel mechanics in Season 2 are also worth a moment of appreciation from a world-building perspective. The show does not just use the multiverse as a backdrop. It thinks through the logical and emotional implications of what it would mean to be able to move between realities. What would it mean for your sense of identity? What would it mean for your relationships? If there are infinite versions of the people you love, what does that do to the specific love you have for the specific version of them that you know? These are not questions the show answers definitively, but it asks them in ways that stick with you. Let us appreciate for a moment how Season 2 manages its ensemble. This is a show with an enormous cast of characters, many of whom have their own complex storylines and emotional arcs. Keeping all of those plates spinning without any of them feeling neglected or perfunctory is a genuine organizational challenge, and Season 2 handles it with remarkable grace. Part of how they do this is by understanding which characters to put in the same orbit at any given time so that their stories can develop in ways that illuminate each other. Cecil and Debbie, for example, occupy very different emotional registers, but putting them in proximity to each other creates a kind of dialogue between their worldviews that enriches both of their storylines. The way the show depicts government and institutional power in Season 2 is also really interesting. The Global Defense Agency and the way it operates raises all kinds of questions about accountability, about who gets to make decisions that affect everyone, about the difference between authority granted by institutions and authority earned through genuine service. These are not abstract political questions in the context of the show. They play out through the lived experiences of characters we care about, which makes them feel urgent and personal rather than theoretical. Here is one more thing that I find endlessly compelling about Season 2, and it is maybe the thing that stays with me the most. The show is deeply invested in the question of what we owe each other. What do parents owe their children? What do children owe their parents? What do heroes owe the people they protect? What do those people owe the heroes who sacrifice for them? There are no easy answers, and the show does not try to provide them. Instead, it keeps returning to the question from different angles, through different characters, and lets the weight of it accumulate over time. By the time the season ends, you have been sitting with that question for hours, and it has gotten under your skin in a way that the most spectacular action sequences never quite manage. So as you let all of this drift through your mind tonight, think about the layers that are working in a show like this. Think about the color palettes and the sound design, the careful psychology of characters dealing with trauma in real and honest ways, the philosophical weight of the multiverse storyline, the way a show about superheroes can be a genuinely grown-up exploration of identity, legacy, and what it costs to choose to be good. The craft that goes into something like Season 2 of Invincible is extraordinary, and it is the kind of thing that rewards not just watching but thinking. So let it settle. Let the images and ideas move through your mind as you rest tonight. Sometimes the best appreciation for something beautiful is just letting it be there with you quietly. Sleep well. The Viltrumite Empire conquered thousands of worlds before you were born, and tonight, while you rest, you're finally going to understand exactly how they did it. Invincible is an animated superhero series streaming on Amazon Prime Video. It is based on the comic book series created by Robert Kirkman, the same writer behind The Walking Dead. The comics ran from 2003 to 2018, and they have become one of the most beloved independent superhero stories ever published. The animated series began in 2021 and has steadily built an enormous audience, largely because it takes the superhero genre seriously in ways that few other productions dare to attempt. It does not shy away from consequences. Characters get hurt. Badly. And the emotional weight of those injuries carries forward into subsequent episodes and seasons, which is something that feels genuinely rare in a genre often defined by its heroes walking away from impossible situations completely unscathed. The central character is Mark Grayson, a teenager who discovers he has inherited extraordinary powers from his father. His father goes by the name Nolan Grayson on Earth, but in the broader universe, he is known as Omni-Man. Nolan is a Viltrumite, a member of a civilization of incredibly powerful beings who have built a vast interstellar empire through conquest and subjugation. On Earth, Nolan presents himself as a hero, a protector, someone who genuinely cares about humanity. And for a long time, he does care. But his mission, the mission given to him by his empire, was always something far darker. The collision between who Nolan actually is and what he was sent to Earth to do forms one of the emotional cores of the entire series. Mark takes the name Invincible as his superhero identity, which carries a lovely layer of irony throughout the story because he is very much vincible. He gets hurt constantly. He recovers, because Viltrumite biology is extraordinary, but the process is never painless or easy. One of the things that makes Invincible stand out as a superhero story is precisely this willingness to show the cost of violence in a way that feels honest. When Mark fights someone genuinely dangerous, you feel afraid for him in a way you rarely feel afraid for more traditional superhero protagonists. The Viltrumites themselves are one of the most fascinating elements of the entire Invincible universe. As a civilization, they believe that everything in existence belongs to them. This philosophy traces back to their founder, a figure named Argol, and has been passed down through generations, instilled deeply into every Viltrumite born into the Empire. The belief system is not simply arrogance, though it is certainly that too. It is a comprehensive worldview, almost a religion, that justifies every act of conquest and domination as a natural expression of Viltrumite destiny. Understanding this helps explain why individual Viltrumites who might otherwise seem monstrous are operating from a deeply held internal logic that makes complete sense to them. At the top of the Viltrumite hierarchy sits Grand Regent Thrag. He is, without question, the most powerful Viltrumite in the universe. He was raised from birth to embody everything Argol's philosophy represents. He is not biologically descended from Argol, but his relationship to that legacy is arguably more intense than any blood connection could be. He carries Argol's skull as a possession, as something precious and sacred, and speaks to it as though seeking guidance or affirmation. It is one of those character details that tells you everything you need to know about who Thrag is without anyone having to explain it to you directly. He has built his entire identity around being the perfect instrument of Argol's vision. His loyalty is absolute. His brutality is almost incomprehensible. And yet the series is careful never to make him simply a monster. He has a coherent internal world, which is somehow even more unsettling. Opposing the Viltrumite Empire is the Coalition of Planets, a gathering of civilizations who have come together to resist Viltrumite domination. The coalition is led by a figure named Thetis, who turns out to be a Viltrumite himself, one who broke away from the Empire after killing Argol. His history with Thrag is therefore deeply personal. Thrag wants revenge for Argol's death. Thetis wants to dismantle the empire he once served. Their conflict is the kind of antagonism built from shared history and opposing convictions, which tends to produce the most compelling rivalries in storytelling. The Viltrumite War is the large-scale conflict that emerges from this tension. It spans an enormous portion of the known universe, drawing in planets, species, and individuals from across the coalition. The war is not a simple good versus evil confrontation. The coalition has overwhelming numbers in terms of participating worlds, but the Viltrumites are so individually powerful that raw numbers alone cannot overcome them. This forces the coalition to think strategically rather than simply throwing forces at the problem. The realization that emerges from this strategic necessity is that killing Thrag might be more valuable than winning any individual battle. If Thrag falls, the theory goes, the Viltrumites will scatter, and then each one can be confronted individually. Facing a single Viltrumite is still an extraordinary challenge, but it is a manageable one. Facing them as a unified force under Thrag is something else entirely. Among the characters fighting alongside the coalition, a few deserve special attention. Alan the alien is a fan favorite, a remarkably resilient character with a unique biological quirk that makes him more powerful each time he nearly dies. His body literally evolves in response to near-death experiences, developing new capabilities to handle threats that almost killed him before. The catch, of course, is that he has to survive those near-death experiences for the evolution to kick in. This makes his role in dangerous situations genuinely tense because you are always aware that the line between evolution and actual death is a very fine one. Tech Jacket is another member of the Coalition's more capable fighters, a character who relies on advanced technological equipment rather than innate biological power. The dynamic between Alan and Tech Jacket provides some of the lighter moments in what is otherwise a very intense storyline, including stretches where they pass time playing video games generated on the fly by Tech Jacket's suit. It is a small human touch in an otherwise cosmic conflict, and it works beautifully. Battle Beast is perhaps the purest distillation of a particular kind of character archetype. He loves fighting, not in an aggressive or angry way, but with genuine, almost childlike enthusiasm. If anyone in the middle of an interstellar war can be said to be having a good time, it is Battle Beast. He is voiced by Michael Dorn, who longtime Star Trek fans will immediately recognize from his years playing Worf in The Next Generation. The casting choice is inspired because Dorn's distinctive voice brings exactly the right combination of weight and gravitas to a character who could easily come across as ridiculous but instead becomes genuinely compelling. Omni-Man's journey throughout the series is one of the most emotionally complex arcs in recent animated television. He began as a villain, or at least as someone executing a villainous mission, but the series has consistently refused to let that be the final word on who he is. His relationship with Earth, with Mark's mother Debbie, with Mark himself, has genuinely changed him. He is not simply a former villain performing redemption for narrative convenience. His change feels earned, rooted in years of genuine connection and love that could not ultimately coexist with what his empire wanted from him. When he fights alongside Mark rather than against him, it carries enormous emotional weight because of everything we know about the distance they had to travel to arrive at that point. His relationship with Oliver is another dimension of this. Oliver is Nolan's son from a relationship he had on a planet called Thraxa. Oliver is half Viltrumite, half Thraxan, and he is physically aging at an accelerated rate compared to humans, which creates its own complicated emotional reality. When he was born, Nolan made a comment that suggested Oliver and his Thraxan mother were a mistake, something Oliver clearly heard and internalized. So when Nolan and Oliver are thrown together while Mark is recovering from his injuries sustained in a brutal fight with Conquest, there is real unresolved pain between them. What unfolds over the weeks of Mark's recovery is a slow, careful process of two people working through resentment and hurt towards something that might eventually resemble a real relationship. The series handles this patiently and honestly. Conquest deserves a moment here. He is one of the most formidable opponents Mark faces. He is a Viltrumite of extreme intensity, someone whose dedication to the Empire borders on fanatical. He is not thoughtful or conflicted. He commits absolutely to what he believes. And yet even he, in retrospect, invites a certain amount of complicated consideration. Omni-Man insists on giving him a proper Viltrumite burial, which tells you something important. Even among enemies, Omni-Man can recognize and respect genuine conviction. The question the series subtly poses is whether Conquest, under different leadership and a different moral framework, could have been something other than what the Empire made him. It is not an easy question, and the series does not pretend it is. Mark kills Conquest in their fight, though because he was unconscious during parts of it and disoriented afterward, he is not immediately certain of this. When he recovers enough to move around and discovers grave markers near their camp, he initially fears the worst, that Omni-Man and Oliver have died while he was unconscious. The relief of discovering the grave belongs to Conquest rather than to his family is quickly complicated by the full weight of realizing that he himself killed someone, even someone as genuinely dangerous as Conquest. The series never lets Mark off the hook emotionally for the violence he engages in, and that consistency is part of what makes his character so worth following. The Viltrum home planet looms large as the conflict progresses. The Coalition's goal of reaching it and confronting Thrag there represents the culmination of the war's central strategic ambition. Getting there is one challenge. What happens when they arrive is another entirely. The Viltrumites at home, on their own world, with Thrag at the center of their defenses, represent a near impossible confrontation for even the strongest members of the Coalition. But impossible confrontations are rather the point of this entire story. The Scourge virus is an element worth understanding because it represents one of the Coalition's most significant strategic cards. It is a biological weapon capable of harming Viltrumites, who are otherwise almost impossible to damage. The version the Coalition possesses has been studied and refined, but there is also a more powerful variation that Omni-Man carries the knowledge of. He considers that more powerful version a measure of last resort, something too dangerous and too consequential to deploy casually. The existence of this kind of weapon within a war story raises familiar and important questions about the ethics of extreme measures in desperate situations. The series does not ignore those questions. The Flaxen Dimension is where Robot and Monster Girl find themselves during this period, though the series has not spent a great deal of time on their storyline within the Viltrumite War arc. Time moves very differently in the Flaxen Dimension compared to the regular universe, which means that even if relatively little time passes on the outside, they experience something far more extended on the inside. Their story there is described as a grand adventure of its own, almost a separate epic contained within the larger narrative of the show. The expectation is that their full storyline will be explored more completely in a future season, though the series acknowledges their situation so viewers do not simply forget about them. One of the more striking structural choices the series makes during the Viltrumite War is the use of extended time passing. Mark's recovery from his injuries takes approximately 2 months, and rather than skipping over that time, the series uses it. The world keeps moving during those weeks. The war progresses. Relationships develop. Oliver's rapid aging continues. Omni-Man processes his complicated history. The episode does not treat the healing period as a narrative inconvenience to be explained away, but as actual story time with actual emotional content. This approach requires patience from the audience, but it pays off in the depth it adds to the relationships we are watching develop. Thetis, as a character, occupies a position of immense moral complexity. He killed Argol, which set in motion the conditions for the Viltrumite War itself. He leads a coalition of worlds that are fighting for their survival against an empire of nearly unstoppable warriors. He is making constant calculated decisions about risk and strategy and sacrifice. And he is a Viltrumite doing all of this, which means he is fighting against his own species, his own civilization, his own origin. The series respects this complexity without resolving it too easily or too neatly. The animation in Invincible is deliberately crafted to match the tonal ambitions of the story it is telling. It is stylized but not whimsical. The action sequences are brutal when they need to be. The quieter character moments are drawn and paced in ways that allow the emotion to land. The color palette shifts depending on where the story is taking place, with the vast cosmic settings of the Viltrumite War having a different visual texture than the earthbound scenes or the intimate camp sequences where Omni-Man and Oliver learn to exist near each other. The voice cast of Invincible is extraordinary. Stephen Yeun voices Mark, bringing a quality of earnest vulnerability to a character who could easily become either insufferably heroic or tiresomely angsty. J.K. Simmons voices Omni-Man, and his performance is one of the great achievements of the series. He delivers warmth and menace in the same breath in a way that feels genuinely difficult and genuinely accomplished. Sandra Oh voices Debbie, Mark's mother, whose journey through the revelations about her husband and her world is its own quietly devastating narrative thread. What makes Invincible last, what makes it the kind of story people want to revisit and understand more deeply, is that it takes its characters seriously. It does not use them as vehicles for action set pieces or plot mechanics. Every confrontation, every moment of violence or loss or reconciliation, is rooted in who these people are and what they have been through. The Viltrumite War is enormous in scale, spanning multiple planets and months of in-universe time, but it never loses sight of the specific human and Viltrumite and alien experience at its center. Thrag's relationship with Argor's legacy, Mark's complicated inheritance of his father's power and guilt, Oliver's search for identity in an impossible situation, Alan's stubborn refusal to simply die, Thetis's long game of resistance against an empire he helped build. All of these individual threads are woven together into something that feels genuinely epic without ever losing its intimacy. The comics that the series is based on concluded in 2018, which means the full arc of where these characters end up already exists, waiting for readers willing to seek it out. The animated series is making its own choices about pacing and presentation, emphasizing different aspects of the story and adapting the source material with intelligence and care. But the bones of the story, the core emotional and philosophical questions it is asking, remain consistent across both forms. What does it mean to inherit a legacy you did not choose? What is the cost of violence, even violence in service of good? Can people who have done terrible things, whether through belief or obedience or simple power, become something different? Is reform possible at a civilizational scale, not just an individual one? These are not easy questions, and Invincible does not pretend they have easy answers. But it keeps asking them, episode after episode, with a consistency and sincerity that is genuinely admirable. The world of Invincible keeps expanding. New characters, new planets, new conflicts that layer themselves onto everything that has come before. But at its center, it remains the story of a young man trying to be good in a universe that is very complicated and frequently unkind. And his father, trying to become better than what he was made to be. And the vast community of beings across the universe, all doing the same kind of struggling, all trying to find a way forward. So as you drift closer to sleep, let these characters rest in your mind. Mark with his beard growing out over 2 months of slow healing. Oliver watching over him, resentment softening into something more tender. Omni-Man building a grave for a man he once fought alongside and against. Battle beast somewhere in the cosmos, completely thrilled about everything. Alan evolving, always barely surviving, always becoming something slightly more capable of facing what comes next. And Thrag, sitting high above the battle, speaking to a skull, certain of his destiny, unaware that certainty is rarely the protection people believe it to be. Sleep well. The universe of Invincible will still be there when you wake up. Robert Kirkman built 2 of the most brutal, emotionally devastating fictional worlds in modern storytelling. And the second one, the one fewer people talk about, might actually be the more ambitious of the 2. Invincible is an animated superhero series based on a comic book created by Robert Kirkman, the same person who created The Walking Dead. The show follows Mark Grayson, a teenager who inherits superpowers from his father, a man known as Omni-Man, who is secretly one of the most powerful beings in the universe. On the surface, it sounds like a fairly standard superhero origin story. But Invincible has always been far more interested in the complicated, messy, emotional side of what it actually means to have that kind of power. And the deeper you go into its mythology, the more intricate and genuinely fascinating the whole thing becomes. One of the most interesting creative decisions in the show is how it handles the concept of suits and costumes. In most superhero stories, a costume change is just a visual refresh. But in Invincible, the suit Mark wears carries enormous symbolic weight. He started with a yellow and black suit that felt bright, optimistic, and full of hope. Then he transitioned into a darker blue suit, which the show's own creator Robert Kirkman compared to Spider-Man's black symbiote costume. The idea being that when a hero goes through a darker period internally, that darkness manifests visually. The blue suit represented Mark at his most burdened, his most conflicted, his most emotionally heavy. And the return to the yellow suit signals something shifting inside him. A small but meaningful step back toward the version of himself he wants to be. There is something quietly profound about that idea. The notion that what we wear, or how we present ourselves to the world, can reflect where we are emotionally. Most of us intuitively understand this. We have all had days where we just throw on something comfortable because we cannot manage anything else. And we have all had moments where getting dressed with intention felt like a small act of reclaiming ourselves. Invincible just scales that idea up to a superhero universe and makes it part of the story. Let your breathing slow down a little. Feel the weight of wherever you are resting. We have so many more interesting things to talk about. The Invincible universe has a surprisingly deep and layered cosmology. Most superhero stories keep their mythology relatively contained. But Invincible goes somewhere genuinely unexpected with the way it structures reality itself. In the story, the universe has existed through multiple cycles, referred to as ages. The current version of reality that all the characters inhabit is actually the 6th iteration. There were 5 previous versions of existence before this one, each with their own beings, their own civilizations, their own wars. The oldest creatures from the very first age are described as almost incomprehensibly powerful. The kind of beings that even the most seasoned supernatural characters in the story do not want to deal with. They are the equivalent of cosmic horror, things that exist so far outside the normal frame of reference that they defy easy categorization. Then there are beings from a second age, and the remnants of those ancient entities still exist in the current world, scattered throughout the universe like geological layers of time that never quite fully disappeared. There is a group called the Vile, from the 4th age, who once ruled both the surface world and the underworld simultaneously. They were immortal, they were dominant, and the only reason humanity exists at all is because they were eventually fought down into submission by beings that came after them. Which leads to one of the more quietly remarkable ideas in Invincible's mythology. The demons, the infernal beings, the creatures that most stories would present as purely evil, are actually the ones who created the conditions under which human life became possible. They are, in a very strange and counterintuitive way, the reason the world exists as it does. That kind of moral inversion is something Invincible does constantly. It takes the things you expect to be straightforward and reveals that the reality is far more complicated. Good and bad are rarely where you think they are. Power does not equal virtue. And the history of any civilization, even a fictional one built across 6 ages of reality, is always messier and more ambiguous than the clean narrative versions we tell ourselves. Let that thought settle. 6 versions of reality, each one ending, each one giving way to something new. And here we are in the 6th, with all the echoes of everything that came before still present in the world, still affecting everything, even when nobody realizes it. The show also has a wonderfully unusual approach to its version of the underworld. Rather than treating hell as a separate dimension or a spiritual plane that exists outside the physical universe, Invincible locates it literally beneath the surface of the earth. Extremely deep, but geographically connected to the world above. This means that in theory, a being with enough power could simply fly downward through the planet and eventually arrive there. It would take an extraordinarily long time, and it would not be a comfortable journey, but the point is that it is physically possible. There is no mystical barrier, no dimensional gateway required. Just depth. There is something oddly grounding about that. Most mythology treats the afterlife as categorically separate from the physical world. Invincible makes it adjacent, almost neighborly. The underworld is not somewhere else. It is just very, very far down. And the beings who live there are not supernatural in the sense of being outside nature. They are part of the same natural order, just operating at a different level of it. This version of the underworld is called the Underrealm in the story, and it has its own politics, its own civil conflicts, its own history stretching back through those multiple ages of reality. The idea that even a place as extreme as hell has internal factions, competing interests, and long-standing grudges is somehow both funny and deeply logical. Of course it does. Why would any collection of powerful beings agree on everything? Why would any civilization, no matter how dark or unusual, be monolithic? Your shoulders can relax now. Feel any tension just releasing. We are just talking about interesting ideas. There is nothing you need to do with any of this. Just let it float through. One of the most compelling ongoing threads in Invincible is the relationship between Mark and his father. Omni-Man, whose real name is Nolan Grayson, arrived on Earth as part of a plan by an alien empire called the Viltrumites. The Viltrumites are a warrior race whose civilization is built around the idea that strength is the ultimate virtue. They have expanded their empire by sending powerful agents to various planets, having those agents blend into the local population, and eventually softening the planet up for conquest. Omni-Man was one of those agents. Mark was the result of him having a family while embedded on Earth. The central tragedy of the early part of the story is discovering that the person Mark looked up to more than anyone in the world had an agenda that ran completely contrary to everything Mark believed in. And yet, the show does not treat Omni-Man as simply a villain, because the truth is more complicated than that. Nolan actually did develop genuine love for his family. He genuinely does care about Mark in ways that conflict with everything his civilization trained him to value. He is a person caught between two irreconcilable versions of himself, and watching him slowly try to navigate that is one of the more emotionally honest things the show does. The Viltrumite War is one of the major arcs in the larger story. The Viltrumites, despite being this terrifyingly powerful empire, actually have a surprisingly small population. A plague wiped out the vast majority of their civilization at some point in the past. They need to repopulate. And this is part of why they have been seeding other planets. They need humans and other species to help rebuild their numbers, which adds yet another layer of complexity to their actions. They are not simply conquerors for the sake of conquest. They are a civilization in crisis, doing increasingly terrible things in service of survival. There is a real-world resonance to that. The way desperation can transform a society. The way the internal logic of a culture under pressure can justify things from the inside that look monstrous from the outside. Invincible is not trying to excuse the Viltrumites, but it is trying to make you understand them. And understanding is not the same as forgiving. Just breathe. Nice and slow. These are just ideas drifting past. You do not have to hold on to any of them. The animation style of Invincible is deliberately crafted to contrast tonal extremes. The show can look bright and clean and almost Saturday morning cartoonish in one moment, and then completely visceral and intense in the next. This was an intentional creative choice. The visual warmth of the animation style creates a kind of cognitive dissonance when things get dark, making the difficult moments feel even more jarring because they exist inside a world that looks like it should be safe. Robert Kirkman has talked about how this contrast was always part of what made the original comics work. The genre is superhero. The aesthetic is accessible. But the emotional and moral content goes places that most superhero stories do not. And by wrapping difficult ideas inside a familiar package, the story gets to do things that a more obviously grim presentation would not be able to do as effectively. You are comfortable. You are engaged. And then something happens that genuinely surprises you. The show also has a wonderful relationship with humor. Even in its darkest episodes, there is comedy woven through. Sometimes this comes from the characters themselves, their reactions and banter. Sometimes it comes from the show being meta about its own production. The animators have built in visual jokes about the economics of animation, moments where the camera cuts away from something that would have been expensive to animate, or where characters reference the difficulty of what they are being asked to do in ways that wink at the audience. There is something endearing about a show that is confident enough in its own identity to make jokes about its own limitations. It says something about the creative culture behind Invincible that even the constraints become part of the storytelling. When you cannot afford to show the giant battle, you make the act of not showing it funny. That is good writing. Let your mind wander a little. We are talking about a fictional universe, but all the best fictional universes feel like they open doors into real questions about how the world works. One of the recurring themes in Invincible is the question of moral absolutes. Mark starts the series with a fairly simple ethical framework. Heroes do not kill. There are always other options. Violence is a last resort and even then something to be ashamed of. And then reality keeps pushing back against that framework. Situation after situation arises where the clean ethical answer does not exist. Where every available option has a cost. Where doing nothing is itself a choice with consequences. This is not a show that glorifies violence. Quite the opposite. Every act of violence in Invincible has weight. There is always something lost. But the show is equally unwilling to pretend that pacifism is always available as an option. Sometimes the world puts you in situations where refusing to act causes as much harm as acting. And learning to live with that complexity, to make difficult choices and keep going, is presented as part of what maturity actually looks like. Most superhero stories avoid this question by engineering situations where the hero always has a clean out. Invincible is specifically interested in the situations where there is no clean out. And watching Mark develop the emotional and moral vocabulary to navigate those situations is one of the most genuinely compelling character arcs in recent animated television. Your body is probably feeling quite heavy now. That comfortable, sinking feeling of being close to sleep. Stay with that. These ideas will still be here, drifting. The character of Damien Darkblood is one of the more interesting supporting players in the Invincible universe. He is a demon detective, and his entire existence is built around contradiction. He is a creature of the underworld who functions as an investigator of truth. He has a past that includes betrayal and redemption, and he serves as a kind of spiritual mirror for Mark in certain storylines, reflecting back the idea that complicated histories do not disqualify anyone from doing meaningful work in the present. The idea of a detective in hell is funny on its face, but it also opens up interesting questions. What does it mean to seek truth in a place defined by deception and punishment? What does justice look like in a context where every soul there presumably did something to end up there? The show does not answer these questions exhaustively, but it asks them, and the asking is valuable. There is a moment in the story where Damien gives Mark something that functions as the highest compliment he can offer. He tells Mark there is a detective inside him. What he means is that Mark has the capacity to look at a complicated situation, resist the easy answer, and keep searching for what is actually true. In the context of Mark's moral journey, that is a profound thing to be told. Especially by someone who has spent existence in a place built around things being what they appear to be rather than what they actually are. Let that image rest in your mind. A detective in hell, looking for truth in the most unlikely place. Sometimes that is what growing up feels like too. Trying to find something solid and real in situations that seem designed to obscure it. The world building in Invincible extends beyond the supernatural. The Viltrumite civilization has its own history, its own culture, its own internal logic. Their obsession with strength is not simply arrogance. It is the product of a species that survived by being the most powerful force anywhere they encountered. Their values formed around that survival pressure and calcified over millennia into something that looks from the outside like cruelty but feels from the inside like pragmatism. They believe weakness is genuinely dangerous. Not just for individuals but for civilizations. And their history gives them some evidence for that belief, even if the conclusions they draw from it are ones most people would reject. Understanding how a culture's values emerge from its history is one of those endlessly interesting threads to pull on. Every value system makes sense from inside itself. The question is always what assumptions are built into the foundation, what experiences shape those assumptions, and whether those assumptions still apply in the world as it currently exists. Invincible uses the Viltrumites to make that question tangible and dramatic. Your breathing is slow and even. There is no rush. The story will still be there whenever you want to return to it. One of the smaller but genuinely charming details of the Invincible universe is the way it handles the existence of monsters. Not narrative monsters or metaphorical monsters, but actual large creatures that appear throughout the story. The explanation for these beings is that they are remnants. Leftover traces of previous ages of reality. The universe has reset itself multiple times, and each time it does, not everything from the previous version simply vanishes. Some things persist. Some things survive the transition. The older the creature, the more powerful it tends to be. The oldest surviving beings from the earliest ages of reality are so far beyond the scale of anything in the current age that even the most powerful current beings are cautious about engaging with them. They are not evil in any conventional sense. They are just ancient, predating any framework of morality or civilization that currently exists. They are, in a sense, the universe's memory of itself. There is something poetic about that. The idea that even after everything ends and everything begins again, some things remain. Some things carry through. The universe forgets everything except what refuses to be forgotten. And perhaps that is a thought to carry into sleep with you tonight. That things persist. That the interesting, complicated, layered history of anything, a civilization, a universe, a person, does not simply vanish. It accumulates. It echoes. And sometimes those echoes are the most important part. Invincible is a show that takes superhero storytelling seriously while never losing its sense of play. It builds a universe with genuine depth and then populates that universe with characters who feel like they have real interiority, real histories, real contradictions. The moral questions it raises are not simple. The answers it offers, when it offers them, are not clean. But that is what makes it interesting. That is what makes it worth paying attention to. The Viltrumite war that looms over the current story is not just a military conflict. It is a reckoning. For Mark, for Nolan, for the whole question of what Earth is and what it deserves to be. The stakes are not just physical. They are existential in the most literal sense. And the way the story is building toward that reckoning, layering in mythology and character development and moral complexity, suggests that whatever comes next will be worth the wait. But for now, there is nothing you need to do about any of that. The story will unfold in its own time. The Viltrumites will have their war. Mark will figure out who he is. Damien Darkblood will investigate whatever needs investigating. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of a fictional Earth, in a place called the Underrealm that is not quite hell and not quite anywhere else, beings from the fifth age of reality will continue their ancient conflicts. You can let all of that drift now. Let the images go soft. The yellow suit. The deep fall. The old monsters sleeping in the dark. The sixth version of reality, carrying all the echoes of the five that came before. There is something reassuring about a story that takes its own mythology seriously. That builds something with enough depth that even the corners of it are interesting. That treats its audience as capable of caring about complicated things. And there is something reassuring too about the idea at the center of Mark's arc. That it is possible to go through very dark periods and come back. That the yellow suit was always there, kept waiting, because the person who made it believe that eventually the one who needed it would find their way back to it. That is a good thought to rest with. Things kept in good faith. Things waiting patiently. People finding their way back to who they want to be, one small decision at a time. Sleep well. The universe is very large and very old and very interesting, and it will all still be there when you wake up. Somewhere between the chaos of Omni-Man's first fight and the quiet hum of your ceiling fan, there's a perfect place to let your mind finally go still, and tonight, that place is the world of Invincible. Let us begin at the very beginning, which is always a good place to start. Invincible began not as a television show or a streaming series, but as a comic book. Robert Kirkman, the creator behind the story, launched the comic series in the early 2000s. At the time, Kirkman was a young writer making his way through the comics industry, and Invincible was his opportunity to explore the superhero genre from the inside out. The story centers on Mark Grayson, a teenager whose father is the most powerful superhero on Earth. For most of his life, Mark grows up in the shadow of his famous dad, waiting to see if he will inherit any abilities of his own. When his powers do eventually arrive, it feels at first like the beginning of a classic superhero story. But Invincible was never really a classic superhero story in the traditional sense. It was always something more complicated, more emotionally honest, and considerably more willing to go to dark and unexpected places. The comics ran for many years and eventually reached a satisfying conclusion, which is actually somewhat rare for superhero comics. Robert Kirkman wrote the ending himself and brought the story to a genuine close, something that fans of long-running comic series do not always get to experience. The entire run of the comic is available to read, which means that anyone curious about where the animated show is headed can peek ahead and get a sense of the journey that lies before the characters. The show adapts these comics with a great deal of faithfulness, though Kirkman himself has talked openly about the ways he uses the animated version as a chance to revisit and rework certain elements of the original story. As he has described it, there are things he wrote when he was younger that he looks back on with a critical eye, and the show gives him the opportunity to make different choices, to smooth out rough edges, or to expand on moments that felt underdeveloped the first time around. One of the most striking things about how the animated show handles its source material is how it balances large-scale spectacle with intimate character moments. The show is not afraid to slow down and spend time with its characters outside of the action. It wants you to understand who these people are, what they want, what they fear, and what they are willing to sacrifice. That emotional investment is part of what makes the bigger dramatic moments land with such weight. When something difficult happens to a character you have grown to care about, it genuinely hurts in a way that superhero stories do not always manage to achieve. Now close your eyes for just a moment if you like. Imagine the opening moments of the very first episode. A neighborhood, a house, an ordinary family having breakfast. Everything looks perfectly normal, almost aggressively so. That contrast between the mundane and the extraordinary is something the show uses brilliantly throughout its run. The quiet moments make the loud ones louder. The ordinary scenes make the strange ones stranger. It is a deliberate and effective creative choice that runs like a thread through the entire series. Mark's character arc across the seasons is one of the most genuinely compelling in modern animated storytelling. He starts out optimistic, earnest, and full of the kind of idealism that a young person discovers when they first realize they have the power to help others. He believes in a code. He believes that being a hero means not crossing certain lines. And then the world begins to test that belief in increasingly severe ways. Each season finds new ways to challenge his assumptions, to put pressure on his principles, and to force him to reckon with the gap between the hero he wants to be and the reality of what protecting people sometimes requires. It is the kind of character development that takes years to build properly, and the show gives itself the time to do it right. The voice cast assembled for Invincible is genuinely extraordinary. Stephen Yeun brings a warmth and vulnerability to Mark that feels completely authentic. You believe in his hope and you feel his exhaustion. J.K. Simmons voices Nolan Grayson, Mark's father, and the weight and complexity he brings to that role is remarkable. Nolan is not a simple character. He is someone with a long and complicated history, a being who has lived for centuries and carries all of that with him in every conversation and every decision. The way the show explores his relationship with his son, the layers of love and betrayal and eventual reconciliation, is some of the finest dramatic writing in recent animation. Sandra Oh voices Debbie, Mark's mother, and her performance is an anchor for the emotional reality of the show. While the superhero elements involve cosmic battles and alien empires and interdimensional conflicts, Debbie's story is fundamentally about a person whose life was built on a foundation that turned out to be something other than what she believed. Her journey is one of grief and survival and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding yourself after a devastating loss of trust. The show takes her seriously as a character, giving her storylines and development that go well beyond what the original comics provided, which is one of those deliberate additions that Kirkman has embraced as a way of enriching the story. The animation style of Invincible is distinctive. It leans into a certain kind of comic book aesthetic while also committing to moments of real visual intensity. The action sequences do not shy away from consequence. In the superhero genre, there has historically been a tendency to sanitize violence, to make the battles feel exciting and consequence-free. Invincible takes a different approach. The physical reality of these conflicts is made apparent. Characters get hurt. Environments get destroyed. The stakes feel genuine because the show is willing to show you what those stakes actually mean. This commitment to consequence is part of what gives the show its distinctive emotional texture. Let your breathing slow a little as we move deeper into the world of the series. Think about the Viltrumite civilization, the alien empire that forms the backbone of the larger conflict in the story. The Viltrumites are a warrior race, incredibly powerful, nearly immortal, with a civilization built on conquest and the belief that their way is superior. They are not cartoonishly evil in the way that some alien villain races in stories can be. They have their own logic, their own history, their own deeply held beliefs about order and strength and the purpose of the universe. What makes them genuinely frightening is not just their power but the sincerity of their conviction. They believe they are right. That kind of ideological certainty, combined with essentially limitless physical capability, makes for a formidable and fascinating antagonist. The character of Thrag, who emerges as a major figure in the later arcs of the story, is one of the most impressive villains in the entire series. He is not loud or theatrical about his menace. His threat is understated, cold, and deeply serious. He represents the extreme endpoint of Viltrumite philosophy, someone who has internalized every aspect of his civilization's values and pursues them with total relentlessness. Building a character like that takes patience in the storytelling. You introduce them slowly, establish their presence gradually, let the audience develop a sense of who they are before the full weight of that threat becomes apparent. The show understands this and deploys Thrag with the care that a truly significant antagonist deserves. One of the interesting things about how the show manages its storytelling across seasons is the deliberate way it raises the emotional floor with each new arc. The Invincible War storyline that anchors the third season is an enormous event with consequences that ripple outward into everything that follows. When you come out the other side of something like that, the world of the story has genuinely changed. Characters carry the weight of what happened. The normal rhythms of life have been disrupted. Mark in particular wrestles with the moral and psychological aftermath of that conflict in ways that shape everything about how he approaches the next set of challenges. The show is interested in trauma as a real phenomenon, not just as backstory flavor but as something that lives in people and shapes their behavior and their choices over time. As you settle more deeply into rest, let the familiar details of this universe wash gently over your mind. Think about Cecil Stedman and the Global Defense Agency. Cecil is one of those characters who occupies that morally ambiguous space that great storytelling loves to explore. He is not a villain in any simple sense. He genuinely cares about protecting humanity. But his methods, his willingness to make certain kinds of calculations, to treat individuals as expendable pieces in a larger strategic game, puts him in permanent friction with Mark's more idealistic approach to heroism. What makes the dynamic between them interesting is that neither is simply wrong. Cecil understands things about the world that Mark's optimism sometimes blinds him to. And Mark understands things about what it means to be a person that Cecil's strategic mind sometimes loses sight of. Their relationship is a running argument about how to be good in a complicated world, and it never fully resolves because it is not the kind of question that fully resolves. The show also has a remarkable ensemble of supporting characters who each bring their own textures and stories. Adam Eve is one of the most powerful figures in the series, with abilities that are genuinely extraordinary even within a world full of extraordinary abilities. Her personal history, her relationship to her powers, and her connections to Mark form one of the emotional cores of the show. The choices she makes throughout the story are not always easy ones, and the show honors the complexity of those choices rather than smoothing them into something simpler and more comfortable. William, Mark's best friend, represents something important in the story as well. He is a person navigating an ordinary human life in proximity to extraordinary events. His reactions, his humor, his moments of genuine fear and wonder provide a grounding perspective that the show uses skillfully. In stories about superheroes, the ordinary human characters can sometimes feel like furniture, present mainly to give the powered characters someone to save. Invincible treats its human characters with more respect than that. They have their own lives, their own concerns, their own evolution as the story progresses. The production process behind the animated show is genuinely demanding. The time required to animate an episode of this quality is substantial. Reports from the creators have indicated that a single episode can take somewhere in the region of 8 to 10 months to animate properly. This is one of the reasons why the gaps between seasons can feel long to eager fans. Quality animation at this level is not something that can be rushed without consequence, as the show has learned at certain points when budget and time constraints have made their presence felt in the final product. The commitment to getting it right, even when that means waiting longer, reflects an artistic integrity that fans ultimately appreciate even when the waiting is frustrating. Robert Kirkman's involvement in the animated version goes well beyond simply licensing his comics. He is deeply engaged in the creative process, working closely with the writers and producers to shape how the story is adapted and what new elements are introduced. His public appearances, including screenings and question and answer sessions for early episodes, reveal a person who is genuinely passionate about this story and these characters, someone who approaches the work with both excitement and a kind of earnest perfectionism. His self-criticism about certain elements of the original comics, the sense that he could have done things better when he was younger, is actually a mark of genuine creative seriousness. Most people do not get the chance to revisit their early work and make it better. Kirkman is using that opportunity thoughtfully. The long-term ambitions for the show are substantial. The current planning envisions multiple additional seasons, with the possibility of the story continuing well into the future as long as the creative and business conditions support it. The source material is rich enough to support this kind of extended run. The comics told a complete story with a definitive ending, which means the show has a destination it is moving toward, even as it takes its own path to get there. That sense of narrative direction, the knowledge that the story has somewhere specific it is going, is part of what gives the show its dramatic coherence. It is not simply generating content season after season without a plan. It is adapting a complete and finished story, which gives it a structural integrity that longer-running shows without a defined ending sometimes lack. Let your thoughts drift now to some of the smaller pleasures of the series. The title sequences each season contain their own hidden meanings and visual jokes. There is a tradition in the show of using the opening credits as a kind of puzzle or Easter egg, building in references and surprises that reward attentive viewing. The gradual revelation of what the title imagery actually depicts across a season is a playful engagement with the audience, an acknowledgement that the people watching care enough to pay close attention and deserve to be rewarded for that attention. These small creative touches contribute to the feeling that the show is made by people who genuinely love what they are doing and want the audience to have fun engaging with it on multiple levels. The sound design and music of Invincible also deserve acknowledgement in any serious appreciation of the show. The sonic landscape of the series, from the score during quiet emotional scenes to the audio design during the larger action sequences, is carefully crafted to serve the story. Music in animated shows can sometimes feel generic or disconnected from the specific emotional needs of individual moments. Invincible takes a more intentional approach, using its audio elements to reinforce and deepen what is happening on screen. Consider for a moment the broader significance of what Invincible has accomplished within the landscape of superhero storytelling. The genre has been dominant in popular culture for an extended period now, and that dominance has come with a certain formula, a set of expected rhythms and emotional beats that audiences have become very familiar with. Invincible operates within the superhero genre while consistently pushing against its conventions. It asks harder questions, accepts more difficult answers, and refuses the comfort of easy resolution. That willingness to be genuinely challenging while remaining genuinely entertaining is not as common as it should be, and it is one of the primary reasons the show has earned such devoted appreciation from its audience. The relationship between generations is one of the thematic threads that runs through the entire story. Mark is defined in large part by his relationship with his father and what he does with the legacy that father has left him, both the heroic aspects of that legacy and the deeply problematic ones. How do you take what you have inherited and make it into something that reflects your own values rather than simply perpetuating what came before? That question sits at the heart of Mark's journey, and it resonates well beyond the specific circumstances of superhero mythology. It is a fundamentally human question about identity and inheritance and the work of becoming your own person. As the night deepens around you and your body sinks further into rest, let these stories settle softly in your mind. The world of Invincible is vast and strange and full of characters who are doing their best in circumstances that frequently overwhelm them. There is something reassuring about that, actually. Even people with extraordinary power struggle with ordinary human problems. Even the most capable heroes have moments of doubt and confusion and regret. The show does not pretend that strength makes things simple or that having the ability to help means always knowing how to help. It sits with the difficulty honestly, and that honesty is part of what makes it such compelling company. Think about the moments throughout the series where unexpected kindness appears in dark circumstances. The small acts of connection between characters who might otherwise be enemies. The conversations that happen in the aftermath of conflict, when the adrenaline has faded and people are left with the human reality of what has happened. These quiet moments are as important to the texture of the show as any of its spectacular set pieces. They are the moments where the story reveals its heart, where you see what it actually values and what it believes about people and their capacity for understanding and change. The future of the story holds many things. The Viltrumite War arc that lies ahead in the narrative is one of the most significant and ambitious storylines in the entire comic series. It represents a genuine escalation, a raising of the stakes that involves not just individual characters but entire civilizations and the fate of the larger universe. Preparing the audience for that kind of conflict requires careful groundwork, and the show has been laying that groundwork deliberately and patiently. When the larger confrontation arrives, it will have been earned. The live-action film that has been discussed in connection with the property exists in that interesting space of long-term Hollywood development. The possibility is real, but the timeline is genuinely uncertain, and the relationship between the animated series and any eventual live-action adaptation is something that will have to be navigated carefully. Stories that exist in multiple formats simultaneously can become complicated, and the creative decisions about how to manage those complications will matter for both versions of the story. For now, though, the animated series stands on its own as one of the finest examples of its kind. It is a show that respects its audience's intelligence, takes its characters seriously, and commits fully to the emotional consequences of its narrative choices. In a media landscape that often opts for the safe and comfortable, Invincible continues to choose the interesting path, the more demanding path, the path that requires its characters and its audience to engage fully with what it means to try to be good in a world that resists simple answers. And as you rest now, as your breathing slows and the sounds of the day fade away, carry with you the quiet satisfaction of knowing there is more of this story still to come. More adventures, more challenges, more of the emotional honesty that makes this world worth inhabiting in imagination. The best stories have a way of staying with us even after we have closed our eyes, settling into the deeper parts of our minds where they continue to do their work. Invincible is that kind of story. It earns its place in the imagination and holds it with something that feels almost like genuine affection between the story and the people who love it. Let yourself drift now. The world of Mark Grayson will be there when you return to it. For now, there is only the quiet and the rest and the slow, pleasant dissolving of the day into the soft darkness of sleep. You are safe. You are comfortable. And the stories will be waiting for you on the other side of tonight. 50 beings. Each one thousands of years old. Each one strong enough to crack a planet. And one of them spent 20 years pretending to be your friendly neighborhood superhero. Let that settle over you as you close your eyes tonight. Invincible is an animated superhero series based on the comic books created by Robert Kirkman, the same person who brought us The Walking Dead. The show is incredibly detailed, layered with emotional storytelling, complex characters, and a universe that feels genuinely vast and alive. Tonight we are going to wander through some of the most interesting facts and details about the show, particularly around the storylines involving the Viltrumite civilization, the characters who carry this story, and the emotional weight that makes this show so much more than just a superhero action series. Let's begin with the world itself. The Viltrumites are an ancient alien civilization, incredibly powerful beings who have spent thousands of years conquering planets across the galaxy. What makes them fascinating is that they don't just conquer in the traditional sense. Their ultimate goal is something more calculated, more patient. They seek to blend their genetics with other species, to rebuild and strengthen their race, which over time had become dangerously small in number. Despite their immense power, there are only about 50 true Viltrumites left alive in the entire known universe. Think about that for a moment. 50 individuals, each one capable of leveling cities, each one living for thousands of years, and all of them working toward a singular purpose that has been ingrained in them since birth. Nolan Grayson, also known as Omni-Man, is one of those Viltrumites. He came to Earth roughly 20 years before the events of the show's main timeline, and his mission was to assess whether humans and Viltrumites could successfully interbreed. He wasn't just a scout. He was part of a long-term plan, an advance wave designed to prepare a planet for full Viltrumite colonization. He built a life here. He married a woman named Debbie, had a son named Mark, became the world's greatest superhero in the eyes of humanity, and spent 2 decades slowly becoming something he was never supposed to become. He became a person who actually loved his life on Earth. Now, here's the part that's so quietly heartbreaking if you really sit with it. When Nolan first arrived, he was hoping his son Mark would not develop Viltrumite powers. That might seem strange at first. Why would a Viltrumite not want his child to be powerful? The answer tells you everything about the complexity of this character. If Mark never developed powers, it would suggest that humans and Viltrumites couldn't successfully interbreed, and the Empire might have just moved on, told Nolan to abandon Earth and try another planet. But if Mark did develop powers, that was a signal. A signal that the experiment worked, that Earth was viable, and that the rest of the Viltrumite Empire would eventually show up to begin the colonization process in full. So when Mark did develop his powers at 17, Nolan knew that everything was going to change. The countdown had begun. And yet, rather than embracing that outcome, something in him pulled in a different direction entirely. He had been living as a human in many important ways. He had loved Debbie. He had watched Mark grow up. He had built friendships, routines, a quiet life alongside all the heroics. 1,000 years of following orders, of being a perfect soldier for the Empire, and it was 20 years on a small planet with a human woman and their half-human son that had finally started to crack something open in him. Mark himself, whose superhero name is Invincible, is the emotional center of the entire series. He's a teenager when his powers first manifest, and like any kid that age, he's figuring out who he is while also suddenly being able to fly and punch through walls. The show does something really thoughtful with his character. It lets him make mistakes. It lets him be wrong about things. It gives him a moral journey that doesn't arrive at clean answers quickly. One of the recurring tensions in his story is figuring out when it's okay to kill, when violence is justified, and where the line is between being a hero and being something darker. By the time the Viltrumite War storyline begins to unfold, Mark has been through an enormous amount. He's faced enemies that nearly killed him, lost people he cared about, and had to reconcile the fact that his father, the man he idolized, was not the hero he thought he was. The emotional fallout from learning the truth about Omni-Man reshapes Mark's entire worldview, and it takes seasons for that wound to even begin to close. Let's talk about Debbie for a moment, because she is genuinely one of the most important characters in the show, arguably more so than even the comics gave her credit for. In the source material she appears throughout, but the animated series really digs into who she is as a person. She's not just a supporting character in her husband and son story. She's a fully realized human being dealing with a betrayal that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. Imagine finding out that the person you loved for over 2 decades, the father of your child, was not who you thought he was at all. That everything you built together had a shadow underneath it the whole time. And yet, there's something remarkable about Debbie. She keeps going. She rebuilds herself. She finds new relationships, new purpose. And according to the lore of the show, she is quietly one of the most important figures in the entire Invincible universe. Why? Because of how she raised Mark. There are alternate universe versions of Mark Grayson scattered throughout the multiverse, and in almost every single one of them, that version of Mark ended up becoming something terrible, conquering worlds, following in his father's Viltrumite footsteps. The one version who turned out good, the version we follow, is the one raised by this particular Debbie in this particular universe. She made him who he is. That's not a small detail. That's everything. Now let's drift a little deeper into the supporting cast, because Invincible has one of the richest ensemble casts in any animated series. Alan the alien is a wonderful character, an alien from a species called the Unopans who was originally bred as a champion fighter. He becomes one of Mark's closest friends and a key member of the Coalition of Planets, a group dedicated to resisting Viltrumite domination across the galaxy. Alan is funny, warm, surprisingly wise, and his friendship with Mark feels genuinely earned over time. He also has a pet that is described as cat-like, which is exactly the kind of small, humanizing detail this show sprinkles throughout to remind you that even in the middle of galactic war, characters have ordinary moments of joy. Oliver, Mark's younger half-brother, is another fascinating piece of this universe. His mother was from a species called the Thraxans, and Oliver grows at an accelerated rate, aging physically much faster than a human child would. He has complicated feelings about Omni-Man, their shared father, and a fierce desire to prove himself that sometimes overrides his better judgment. He's brave sometimes to the point of recklessness, and watching him navigate his own relationship with Nolan is one of the quieter emotional threads running through the Viltrumite War storyline. Tech Jacket in the animated series is a character named Zoe Thompson, a young woman whose powered suit gives her abilities to match some of the strongest fighters in the universe. The suit's artificial intelligence is a companion and guide in battle, and her father is portrayed as a warm and supportive presence, deliberately contrasting with the complicated father-son dynamics that run throughout the rest of the show. She joins the coalition team heading into the Viltrumite War, and her resourcefulness in impossible situations makes her a standout character. Conquest is the kind of villain who stays with you. An elder Viltrumite of immense power and cruelty, he views combat not as a necessary means to an end, but as something to be savored. His fight with Mark is one of the most brutal and emotionally costly battles in the entire series. By the time of their rematch, Mark has grown significantly as a fighter, but Conquest is no less dangerous. The fight is vicious, prolonged, and ugly in the way that only truly high-stakes combat can be. Mark barely survives. His injuries are catastrophic. But he wins, decisively and permanently this time, and the victory costs him nearly everything. What makes that fight resonate so deeply is what it represents within Mark's moral journey. Earlier in the series, Mark struggled enormously with the idea of killing. There was a version of him that wanted to believe there was always another way, that heroes didn't have to cross that line. But the show is honest about the fact that sometimes, facing a being like Conquest, hesitation is not mercy, it's just a slower kind of failure. By the time of their rematch, Mark has arrived at a place where he can make that choice, can carry it, can live with it. That's not portrayed as a victory in itself. It's portrayed as a weight he's chosen to carry, and the show treats that distinction with real care. The Viltrumite War itself is not a single battle. It's a campaign, a series of conflicts that will unfold across a significant stretch of the story. The coalition of planets, led by a character named Thetis, has been preparing for this confrontation for a long time, and even with their best fighters assembled, the raw power difference between them and the Viltrumites is enormous. Remember that these 50 remaining Viltrumites have conquered hundreds of worlds. They don't fight alone either. They have armies of beings from those conquered races fighting alongside them, worlds that serve out of fear or obligation rather than any loyalty. There's also the matter of a traitor, a mole within the coalition, which creates a tension of mistrust running underneath all the preparations for war. Who is it? What have they given away? How much does the Viltrumite Empire already know? These questions don't resolve quickly, and they color every planning session, every strategic decision the coalition makes. Cecil Stedman, the director of the Global Defense Agency here on Earth, is one of the show's most complex non-powered figures. He's not a hero in any conventional sense. He's a pragmatist, someone who believes the world is best protected through intelligence, contingency plans, and occasionally ruthless decisions made in the shadows. He monitors Omni-Man's return to Earth with careful attention, aware of the Viltrumite War beginning to take shape but seemingly calculating that the coalition might handle it before it becomes Earth's problem directly. Cecil knows about things he doesn't always share, and Mark's relationship with him is one of the most fraught and interesting dynamics in the show. Eve, whose superhero name is Adam Eve, is one of the most powerful beings on the planet, with the ability to reshape matter at a molecular level. She and Mark are deeply in love, and their relationship is one of the genuine emotional anchors of the series. As the Viltrumite War begins, Eve is dealing with a pregnancy, something she hasn't yet told Mark about. Her powers are unreliable because of the pregnancy, which keeps her from being able to join the fight. She makes the deliberate choice not to tell Mark before he leaves for the war, not wanting to distract him with news that could make him reckless or pull his focus at the worst possible moment. It's a decision made out of love, but it creates a painful gap between them, especially given how long Mark winds up being unable to return due to his injuries. The relationship between Mark and Eve is one of the few places in the show where warmth and safety live, and every threat to that connection hits the audience hard precisely because of how carefully the show has built it. Robot and Monster Girl are another fascinating thread in this universe. The two of them ended up trapped in an alternate dimension, and their story there plays out like something from a classic science fiction adventure. Entire civilizations, strange physics, years passing for them while only a fraction of that time passes in the main world. Their return to the main timeline, when it eventually comes, is going to bring its own complicated emotional reckoning. Battle Beast is a character who deserves his own quiet moment of appreciation. He is an alien warrior who lives only for combat, seeking opponents worthy of his abilities. He is not subtle. He is not political. He fights because fighting is the truest expression of who he is. But there's something almost honorable about his simplicity, and when he eventually joins the Coalition's efforts against the Viltrumites, his presence tips balances in ways that matter. Let's come back to Nolan one more time, because there's something worth sitting with about his 1,000 years of life. Imagine living that long, most of it in service to an empire, following orders, conquering planets, living as a soldier rather than as a person. He didn't even know what he was missing until he had it. Until Debbie. Until Mark. Until the ordinary quiet of a life lived for its own sake rather than for an empire's agenda. And then having to stand in front of the person he loved most and try to explain all of it, knowing that no explanation makes it okay, that words don't have the weight to carry that kind of apology. He makes the attempt anyway. He tells her that those 20 years with her were the most real years of his entire 1,000-year existence. That he is going to spend the rest of his life trying to make things right, knowing that he may never fully succeed. She doesn't let him off the hook. She shouldn't. But the attempt itself, the vulnerability of it coming from someone who spent centuries as an unstoppable warrior, is one of the quietest and most human moments in the whole show. There's a dinner scene before Mark and the others leave for the Viltrumite War where they eat Korean food, a reflection of Debbie's heritage. It's one of those details that feels small on the surface but carries a lot of meaning. This family, fractured and complicated and hurting in all kinds of ways, still sitting down to share a meal together, still finding those ordinary rituals of connection even at the edge of something enormous and frightening. That's what Invincible does better than almost anything else in the superhero genre. It remembers that the people behind the powers are still people. Art, the tailor who has made suits for Omni-Man over the years, has a brief but emotionally heavy scene when Nolan comes to say goodbye and finds that their friendship, like so much else, has been irreparably changed by everything that came to light. Art tells him not to come back, that their time is done. And then, after Nolan leaves, he breaks down. Not from fear, though some of that is there, but from grief. For the friendship they had, for the version of Nolan he thought he knew, for the loss of something that had mattered to him deeply. It's a small scene in the context of everything else happening, but it lands. As the Viltrumite War begins in earnest, as the Coalition's team moves into the conflict, as battles are fought and terrible prices are paid, the show keeps returning to these intimate human moments. That balance is what makes the larger conflicts feel meaningful rather than just spectacular. You care about the outcome because you care about the people caught up in it, and you care about them because the show has taken the time, consistently and carefully, to show you who they really are. The Viltrumite War is a long conflict. It will not resolve quickly. There will be losses, reversals, moments of impossible courage, and moments where the scale of what they're facing feels truly overwhelming. But there's also going to be growth in it. Oliver finding his footing. Nolan discovering what kind of father he can still be. Mark healing, literally and in every other sense, from wounds that go far deeper than the physical ones. And somewhere back on Earth, Eve is waiting, carrying a secret, her powers still uncertain, her heart split between worry and hope. Robot and Monster Girl are somewhere in between dimensions, living out a whole other kind of story. Cecil is watching his screens, calculating, always calculating. And the 50 most powerful beings in the known universe are moving through the galaxy with patient certainty, because they have been doing this for thousands of years and they don't expect this particular resistance to be any different from all the others. But this resistance has something the others didn't. It is people who have genuinely chosen to fight, not out of conquest or fear or imperial programming, but because they love something, love people, love a life worth protecting. That's what Invincible, at its core, is really about. Not powers or battles or even survival. It's about what you choose to fight for, and whether who you love can make you into something better than what you were before you found them. So let that settle in as you drift off tonight. The universe is impossibly vast, full of ancient civilizations and galactic conflicts and beings who have lived for 1,000 years. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a half-human kid from a suburb on Earth is choosing, again and again, to be the version of himself his mother raised him to be. Sleep well. Robert Kirkman built a universe so detailed that even the corners of it have history, and tonight, those quiet corners are yours to drift through. So let's begin at the beginning. Or rather, before the beginning. Because the world of Invincible, in so many ways, is about what happened long before the story we see on screen or read on the page. It's a universe built on ancient civilizations, on wars that were fought across star systems, on choices made thousands of years ago that ripple forward through time and change everything. And there's something genuinely soothing about that kind of storytelling. The sense that history is long and deep, that no single moment exists in isolation, that everything connects to something older and something still to come. The show Invincible is based on a comic book series created by Robert Kirkman, who is also the person behind The Walking Dead. The Invincible comics ran for many years and built an enormously detailed universe, one that the animated adaptation on Amazon Prime has been carefully and lovingly bringing to life. What makes the show special, among many things, is the way it treats its source material, not as a blueprint to follow rigidly, but as a foundation to build upon. The show expands on scenes that were only briefly mentioned in the comics. It gives new voice and new life to characters who existed mostly in the margins. It fills in gaps that readers might not have even known were there. The main character is Mark Grayson, also known as Invincible. He's a teenager, the son of a man named Nolan Grayson, who most people know as the superhero Omni-Man. Omni-Man is one of the most powerful beings in the universe, a member of a species called the Viltrumites. And the show begins with Mark discovering that he has inherited his father's powers. Flight, incredible speed, strength that can shatter mountains. But the story is not really about those powers. Not at its core. It's about identity and family and the weight of expectation and what it means to do the right thing when the right thing is genuinely difficult to determine. Let your breathing slow down a little. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever surface you're resting on. Let the muscles in your shoulders release. There's nothing you need to do right now. Just listen. The Viltrumites are central to almost everything that happens in Invincible. They are an ancient race of beings who evolved on a distant planet. Over thousands of years, they developed incredible physical abilities. They became extraordinarily strong and fast, nearly invulnerable, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space, able to travel between star systems through sheer force of will and biology. And as they grew stronger, they also grew more aggressive. Their civilization became defined by conquest. They moved through the universe, taking worlds, absorbing populations, expanding an empire that stretched across vast stretches of space. At the heart of Viltrumite history is a figure called Argol. He was an emperor, the ruler of Viltrum during one of the most significant periods in their history. In the animated series, we get to see flashbacks to this ancient time, something the original comics did not always provide. These scenes show us the Viltrumites at their height, governing conquered worlds, overseeing alien populations, wrestling with questions of how to maintain control. Argol himself is depicted as powerful and commanding, someone accustomed to absolute authority. When subject races rebel against Viltrumite rule, which happens more and more often during this period, Argol's response is extreme and immediate. A percentage of the population is to be killed as a warning. If the rebellion continues, the entire race is eliminated. This is the logic of empire carried to its most brutal conclusion. Sitting in this flashback council is a younger version of Thetis, a Viltrumite who would eventually become one of the most important figures in the fight against Viltrumite expansion. Thetis tries to argue for a different approach. For mercy. For finding solutions that do not involve mass slaughter. And nobody wants to hear it. There is also a much younger version of General Craig, another familiar face from later in the story. And there is Thrag, who at this point in history serves as Argor's regent. That's an important distinction. Thrag is not in line to become emperor. His role as regent is to manage the day-to-day business of governing the empire while Argor rules, and to hold the throne if something happens before an heir can be located. The question of Argor's heirs is one of the more intriguing threads running through this part of the story, and it connects to revelations that are still unfolding. Let your eyes close fully if they haven't already. Picture the darkness of deep space. Not the terrifying emptiness of it, but the quiet, the stillness. Countless stars scattered across an infinite canvas, each one a sun to worlds you'll never see. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining the scale of it. How small our worries become against the backdrop of a universe this old and this vast. Thetis eventually kills Argor. He does it using a weapon made from Viltrumite bone, which is one of the few materials hard enough to pierce Viltrumite skin. This detail is fascinating in the grim way that a lot of Invincible lore is fascinating. The most effective weapon against a Viltrumite is another Viltrumite. The enemy of this species is, in a very literal sense, itself. Thetis believed that killing Argor would change the Viltrumites, that without their emperor driving them toward endless conquest, they might find a different way of being, a more peaceful path. He was wrong. Because Argor's death put Thrag in charge, and Thrag had a very different vision for the future of his people. Argor's casket is placed before the throne. His skull rests on top of it. Thrag sits on the throne and looks at it every day. He speaks to it. In the comics and the show both, this is one of those details that reveals so much about a character without requiring any explanation. Thrag is not simply a conqueror. He is someone for whom the past is always present. Someone who carries grief and obligation like they are the same thing. He declares that all weakness must be purged from the Viltrumite race. What follows is called the Great Purge, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Viltrumites fighting and killing each other in a brutal process of elimination. Only the strongest survive. Half the population is lost. But what remains is something almost impossibly powerful. A race refined to its absolute peak. And that is when they really begin their campaign to conquer the universe. One of the Viltrumites who survives is Conquest. There's a small scene where even after Thrag orders the purging to stop, Conquest does not want to stop. He would have kept going until he was the last one standing. You can almost see him calculating whether he could take Thrag himself. He decides he probably cannot, and stops. That small moment tells you everything about who Conquest is and why he is so dangerous. He is not motivated by ideology or loyalty. He simply wants to fight. Wants to win. Wants to keep going until there is nothing left to defeat. There is also a young Omni-Man in the crowd during these scenes. Nolan Grayson, Mark's father, present during the Great Purge, alive during this period of Viltrumite history. The show has been slowly filling in pieces of his backstory, helping viewers understand how someone becomes who Omni-Man is. He looks younger here, and one of the interesting things to notice is that Thrag, who is clearly ancient, does not appear to have aged the same way Omni-Man does later. Age affects Viltrumites strangely. As they get older, they slow their aging further. They become functionally immortal at a certain point. But the exact reasons why some of them age in particular ways is tied to genetics and battle history, and things the story is still slowly revealing. Let the weight of your eyelids settle. There's no rush. The story will still be here, moving gently forward, whether you're fully awake or half dreaming. Just let it carry you. After the flashback ends, we return to the present-day story of the show, which takes place on a world called Telescria, the home base of the Coalition of Planets. The coalition is an alliance formed specifically to oppose the Viltrumite Empire, and it is led by Thetis, the same Thetis who killed Argol thousands of years before. He has spent millennia working against the empire he once served. He has recruited aliens and humans and half-Viltrumites and anyone else willing to fight. And now, they face their best opportunity to strike. Thrag and a small number of Viltrumites have retreated to their home planet of Viltrum. The larger Viltrumite forces are scattered across the universe, returning from their various postings and conquests. If the coalition can strike now, before those forces reassemble, they have a chance. Not a great chance, but a chance. Thetis believes that killing Thrag is the key. Without their leader, the Viltrumites will fragment. The unity that makes them so dangerous would collapse, and they could be dealt with one or two at a time. The mathematics of the plan are brutal but straightforward. Find the general, remove the general, watch the army fall into chaos. But Omni-Man has a complication with this plan. Thetis is not interested in making peace with any Viltrumites. His goal is extinction. Every single one of them. And that includes half-Viltrumites. Mark and Oliver, Nolan's sons, would both be on that list. So Omni-Man is being asked to fight alongside someone whose ultimate vision of victory involves the death of his own children. That tension runs through everything that follows. Viltrum itself is a haunting place. Surrounding the planet is a ring, not of ice or rock like Saturn, but of bodies. The preserved remains of the Viltrumites who died during the Great Purge, kept in orbit as a permanent monument. Omni-Man explains this to Oliver when they arrive. The ring exists as a reminder of weakness. Every time a Viltrumite left the planet or returned to it, they saw those bodies. A constant lesson. A constant shame. A civilization that had literally turned its own dead into propaganda. The fight at Viltrum is enormous. Multiple simultaneous battles happening across and inside the planet. Thrag at the center of all of it, effortlessly handling challenger after challenger. Omni-Man goes after him. Then Mark. Then Oliver. Battle Beast tries his luck. Space Racer fires his incredibly powerful Infinity Ray at close range. And Thrag is essentially unbothered by all of it. There is a moment where Mark, who recently killed a Viltrumite named Conquest, announces this fact during the battle. And even the Viltrumites fighting all around them pause. Even Anissa, who has been physically dominating Mark throughout this fight, looks at him differently. Even Thrag is genuinely impressed. He invites Mark to hit him at full strength. Mark does. It does not move Thrag even slightly. Not a single hair displaced. The animation of this moment is apparently stunning, using visual techniques that make Thrag look not just powerful but elemental. Like a force of nature that has simply been given a face. Breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands relax open. The story continues at its own gentle pace, and you are exactly where you're supposed to be. The planet Viltrum is ultimately destroyed. The Coalition uses Space Racer's Infinity Ray to bore a tunnel through the planet's core, and then Omni-Man, Mark, and Oliver fly through that tunnel together, pushing the already fractured crust apart, splitting the planet. The imagery is spectacular, apparently. The debris field. The bodies still floating in that original ring of dead. The silence after something that large and that old simply stops existing. Nolan's reasoning for wanting to destroy the planet is almost poetic in its sadness. He sees Viltrum not as a home but as a tomb. A monument to everything wrong with what his people became. While it exists, the Viltrumites can never truly change. So he helps erase it from the universe. Thrag's response to losing his planet is to kill Thetis. He rips his head off with the same calm efficiency with which he does everything. Declares that Argol has been avenged. The man who killed the Emperor has now been killed. The score, in Thrag's mind, is settled. But the war is far from over. He then turns his attention to Omni-Man, nearly kills him, leaves him in a state of serious injury. Oliver gets his hand crushed and his jaw destroyed. Mark is knocked unconscious. Thrag holds Mark's skull for a moment, looking at the destroyed planet. And then, for reasons he does not fully explain, he lets Mark live. He says he does not want to see more Viltrumites die. But the show seems to be suggesting there is another reason, one tied to things not yet revealed. He then orders the surviving Viltrumites to make for Earth. The plan has changed completely. They no longer have a home planet, so they will take one. Earth is now the target. The Viltrumite remnants will conquer it, settle it, use its human population to rebuild their numbers through interbreeding, and begin again. The empire that lost its home will make a new one out of the world Mark has spent his entire life protecting. There is a gap of several weeks in the story after this battle. Time for people to heal. Alan, a character from the Coalition, is named the new leader now that Thetis is gone. Everyone recovers. But no one can find the Viltrumites, because the Viltrumites are already heading to Earth. They are already on their way. And Earth does not know what is coming. Let your mind wander if it wants to. Let it drift toward that image of space again. The quiet between stars. The long, long distances. The way light takes years to travel from one point to another, so that when you look at a star, you are always seeing the past. There is something comforting in that. History is always arriving. Nothing is ever entirely gone. The animated Invincible series does something that a lot of adaptations of comic books fail to do. It remembers that the best superhero stories are not about the action. The action is the surface. Underneath it is something much more intimate. Family. The complicated love between parents and children. The question of what we owe the people who made us. What we do when the people we love are also capable of terrible things. Omni-Man is a perfect example of this. He is genuinely one of the most powerful beings in the universe. And he has spent his life making choices that have caused enormous harm. Coming to Earth on a mission of conquest, spending 20 years building a family, and then being changed by that family in ways he did not anticipate. His love for his wife and his son is real. And his identity as a Viltrumite conqueror is also real. And those two things cannot coexist. And the entire series is about what happens when that contradiction finally breaks open. Mark carries this same contradiction inside him. He is half human and half one of the most feared species in the universe. He wants to be a hero in the straightforward sense, the kind of hero who shows up and saves people and goes home afterward. But the universe keeps demonstrating that heroism is enormously complicated. That saving one person sometimes means failing another. That the right choice is rarely obvious and often comes with costs that nobody tells you about in advance. The show also has a genuinely unusual willingness to sit with difficult emotions. To let its characters be wrong. To let them be scared. To let them fail. There are episodes where Mark does not win. Where the people around him are hurt and he cannot stop it. Where the bad thing happens despite everything he does. And the show does not flinch from the consequences of those moments. They ripple forward. They change people. Let yourself sink a little deeper. The voice continues. The story keeps moving. But you do not need to hold any of it. Just let it float through, soft and unhurried. One of the interesting things the animated series does is give more screen time and depth to characters who existed mostly in the background of the comics. The Coalition of Planets, for example, is a much more fleshed-out organization on the show. The various alien races, their politics, their histories, their reasons for opposing the Viltrumite Empire, all of this gets more room to breathe. Thetis in particular becomes a genuinely complex figure. He is someone who made an enormous sacrifice, killing his own emperor because he believed it was the right thing, and spent thousands of years working toward a goal, only to find that the methods he is willing to use to achieve that goal have made him something not entirely different from what he was fighting against. He would kill every Viltrumite, including the ones who have done nothing wrong, including children. The purity of his original intention has calcified into something that looks a lot like the ruthlessness he once opposed. Robert Kirkman has talked about how Invincible is, in many ways, a story about cycles. About how violence produces more violence. How empires justify their cruelty with the memory of past injustice. How individuals carry the weight of histories they did not personally create. Mark is the person in this story who has the best chance of breaking one of these cycles. He has access to both the human and the Viltrumite parts of the universe. He is loved by people on both sides. He has, potentially, the ability to find a path that nobody else can find. But the story is honest about how difficult that is. How many things stand in the way? How many powerful people have decided that the cycle must continue? The voice acting in the animated series has been widely praised. The cast is genuinely remarkable. Stephen Yeun voices Mark with a kind of earnest energy that makes you root for him even when he is making obvious mistakes. J.K. Simmons voices Omni-Man with a gravitas that makes every scene feel significant. Sandra Oh plays Mark's mother Debbie with real emotional precision. And there are dozens of guest voices throughout the series, including some surprising choices that speak to the passion of the people making it. The connection between Invincible and Transformers, for example, is more than coincidental. Robert Kirkman grew up deeply devoted to Transformers. It was one of the defining pop culture loves of his life. When casting Thetis, he reached out to Peter Cullen, who has voiced Optimus Prime for decades. And when it came time to use the character of Argall, Kirkman wanted Frank Welker, the voice of Megatron. Getting both of these voices into the same animated universe was clearly deeply meaningful to him. His company Skybound even publishes Transformers comics, completing a circle that started with a kid watching cartoons and grew into someone who got to build universes of his own. Your breathing is slower now. The tension in your body has eased. The day is further away than it was when we started. The thoughts that were loud before are quieter. The story has been doing its work, gently and without hurry, filling the space where anxiety usually lives. The planet Viltrum, before it was destroyed in the show, had orbited its star for longer than human civilization has existed. The ring of dead surrounding it had been there for thousands of years. Thrag had sat on his throne, looking at Argall's skull, for longer than most of the other characters in the story have been alive. There is something that the show does with time that is unusual for superhero storytelling. It takes the long view. It reminds you that civilizations rise and collapse, that the strongest empires eventually face their reckoning, that the most powerful individual is still finite, still mortal in some sense, still subject to the slow pressure of history. After Viltrum is destroyed and the dust of that enormous battle settles, the story turns toward Earth. This has always been where the story was headed. Earth is where Mark grew up. Earth is where his mother lives. Earth is where everything that made him who he is was built. And now the most dangerous military force in the universe is heading there with nothing left to lose. No home planet. No emperor who values any life but Viltrumite lives. Just the cold logic of conquest, looking for a new world to call its own. The season finale of the 4th season is being set up as an epilogue of sorts, a quieter moment to process the enormous events of the battle at Viltrum before the next wave of chaos arrives. This is a storytelling pattern that works very well. Give the audience the explosive confrontation, and then give them space to breathe. Let the characters sit with what just happened. Let the weight of it settle. Let the audience wonder what comes next without rushing directly into the answer. And there is so much that comes next. The comics continue for a long time after this point in the story. There are secrets still unspoken. There are characters whose full histories have not yet been revealed. There are relationships that will change and break and reform. There are moments of genuine joy alongside the violence. Moments where the show remembers to be funny, to be warm, to celebrate the ordinary human pleasures of eating something good or talking to someone you love or just being alive on a planet that is, for this particular moment, not under attack. The world of Invincible is enormous and detailed and rich. It is a universe that rewards attention but also rewards simply being present with it. You do not have to understand everything. You do not have to track every reference or catch every Easter egg. You can simply let it exist around you, this vast fictional cosmos full of ancient wars and complicated love and the ongoing struggle to figure out what it means to be good when goodness is genuinely hard. So let the story continue in your mind, wherever it goes. Let Viltrum drift apart in the darkness. Let Mark rest while he heals. Let the stars keep their long, slow distances from each other. Let Thrag fly toward Earth through the cold of space, a figure of terrifying power and strange, complicated grief. Let Omni-Man lie somewhere healing, thinking about his sons. Let everything be exactly as complicated and as unresolved as it really is, because the story is not finished. It will keep going. There is always more to discover, and you can discover all of it another time. Right now, there is only this moment, the quiet, the dark, the weight of everything softening into rest. The universe is very large and very old and very patient. It will still be there when you wake up. All of its questions will still be waiting, gentle and unhurried, exactly where you left them. Sleep now. The story can wait. It has waited thousands of years already. A few more hours is nothing at all. Just let go. Let your thoughts become pictures and your pictures become nothing in particular. Let the voice become a hum. Let the hum become silence. And let the silence be enough. You are safe. You are still. The night is long and soft and exactly as it should be. Rest.